Hello everyone, welcome to Frightening Tales. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep, so before you drift off I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you're enjoying the story don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. I was so thankful for the fast response, and I would say probably in 3 minutes there were 8 our timing. Would have been a little quicker and I would have been there a little earlier, I'd have probably been one of them. These were the gut-wrenching words from a man who had just witnessed a nightmare come to life in the small town of Sebring, Florida. Just moments away from being the 6th victim, he narrowly escaped the chaos and bloodshed that would soon be known as one of the most horrific crimes this town had ever seen. The police would later describe the crime as devastating and unthinkable, and not just because of the sheer violence but because of the twisted reason behind it. So how did it all unfold? What could have driven someone to commit such horrific bloodshed? Now that we've gathered the official reports and witness statements, we're going to dive deep, unpacking the details of how and why this tragedy happened, and most importantly honoring the 5 beautiful lives lost forever. For starters, let's take a trip back in time, way back to a quiet Wednesday in late January, the 23rd to be exact. It was 2019 and Sebring, Florida was just going about its usual routine. People were settling into the new year, getting back to work and handling business as usual. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, especially not at the Sunrust Bank, where 4 employees were doing what they always did, handling transactions, assisting customers and going through another workday in their small peaceful town. Now Sebring isn't the kind of place where crime is on everyone's mind. It's a quiet, close-knit town nestled in Highlands County where only about 10,000 people live. It's the kind of place where neighbors still wave at each other and folks feel safe running errands or grabbing coffee without a second thought. The thought of a violent crime happening in broad daylight, well, that was something you'd only hear about in the news, not in a place like this. But on this day no one could have imagined that Sebring would make national headlines, all because of one man. That man was Zefanzer, a 21-year-old with a darkness inside him that no one had fully seen coming. As the clock hit about 12:30 p.m., Zefan walked into the bank. He wasn't there to ask about his balance or to do any regular banking. Instead, he was wearing a ballistic vest under his sweatshirt, clearly with one purpose in mind. Without warning, he pulled out a gun and aimed it at a bank teller, ordering her and everyone else in the bank to gather against the wall. In this kind of situation, the employees and customers had no choice but to obey, making Zefan now in control. He then told the teller to lock the doors, trapping everyone inside. Next, Zefan told the 5 women, the bank employees and 1 customer, to lie face down on the floor with their heads toward the wall. There was no explanation, no clear motive, just cold, calculated orders. Then, in a horrifying moment, Zefan shot all 5 women in cold blood, firing 9 shots in total in a span of 5 minutes. It was brutal and shocking, especially in a small town like Sebring where this kind of violence was unheard of. But what happened next was even more chilling. Zefan didn't run. He didn't try to cover his tracks or escape. Instead, he made a bold move. He called 911 at exactly 12:36 p.m. He told the operator that he had just shot 5 people, and just when you thought it couldn't get worse, he walked back to the victims' bodies and fired 2 more shots at them. As he spoke with the dispatcher, he even threatened to kill himself, putting the gun to his own head while still on the phone. Sir, what's going on at the Sunrust Bank in Sebring? I just killed 5 people. Well, technically about to be 6. Can you repeat that? I killed 5 people. You just killed 5 people? Yes, they didn't think I could do it. Why did you do that? I actually don't know, sir. What did you kill them with? 9mm. A 9mm? Yes. Where are they? Lying up against the wall like I told you to. They're lying up against the wall like you told them to. Yep. Okay, why did you do this? I thought that I could. I've wanted to ever since you wanted to do it. Yep, and here we are. Do you know them? What do you know those people? Nope. Where's your gun? Right now in my hand. What are you wearing and where are you? My lobby red sweatshirt, and I'm getting ready to kill myself too. You're getting ready to kill yourself too? Why are you going to do this, sir? Because I've thought about killing people ever since Why can you please explain it to me? I don't know. You don't know why you're going to do it. I've wanted to die since I was 9. I've wanted to kill since I was 11. Why? So what is your name? Not important. You can find it on my body. What is your name? You can find it on my body. I'm sorry, I can't understand you. Can you say your name again? You can find it on my body. It's on your bike. Where is your bike? My body. Your body. Why is that? Why are they going to be able to find it on your body? Because I won't be alive to tell them my name. Can you put the gun down? No, I cannot. We have people coming to help you. Can you put the gun down? There's no help. Why is there no help? What's going on? We've got people going to help you. Okay, what happened? Please stay on the line with me, sir. What is your name? You can find it on my body. Please, sir, can you stay on the line with me? We're going to get you help. I don't want help. Can you please stay on the line with me? We're going to get you help. What happened to you that you wanted to kill yourself since you were 9? Something broke. What broke? What happened? When you were 9 years old? I don't know. You're not sure what happened. Were you living here in Sebring? I was not. Where were you living? Alabama. Where were you living? We want to help you. I really want to help you, but you don't understand. I don't want help. I really want to help you, sir. I really want to help you, and I don't want anything to happen. Okay, as chilling as this sounds, the fact that Zephan was so calm while confessing what he did is just incredibly disturbing, and to make it even worse, the fact that he fired again while on the phone still speaking so calmly is absolutely bone chilling. It's like he felt no remorse, no fear, just pure coldness while the call was still on the line. Victor Sparks, the man you see in that video with his wife Deanna around 12:35 p.m. They had planned to make a deposit, just a normal errand, but when Victor approached the bank's north side doors, he noticed that the doors were locked. He peered through the front glass doors, but it was dark inside and he couldn't see anything. Thinking maybe the doors were just stuck, he tried again, only to find they were still locked. When he peered through the glass doors for the second time, he saw something that made his heart stop. A row of 4 to 5 people lying face down on the floor with a figure walking behind them. It didn't take much for Victor to realize something was terribly wrong. He immediately turned to walk back to his vehicle, but as he did, he heard 2 loud bangs, the unmistakable sound of gunshots. He immediately called the police to report what he had witnessed, but by then the damage was done. Well, when I walked up to the bank, I tried to open the door and it was locked, and I thought, well, this is strange. I leaned up and I shaded my eyes, and I saw at that time 4 to 5 people laying on the far side of the lobby. There was an individual walking behind them. The victims of this horrific crime were later identified as Deborah Cook, age 54, an employee Marisol Lopez, age 55, another employee Jessica Montague, age 31, an employee Cynthia Watson, age 65, a customer, and Anna Pinion Williams, age 37, an employee. All 5 of them had families waiting for them to return home that day. They had plans that would never come to be, and what's even more heartbreaking is that none of these women knew Zeph and Xaver or had any prior contact with him. It all came out of nowhere, and as shocking as it may be, there was one lone survivor, Benjamin Wysokowski, a bank employee. Benjamin, who worked as a teller at the Sunrust Bank, was on his lunch break when he went to grab a quick meal at Checkers. Upon returning to the bank, he greeted a regular customer, Larry Smith, before heading to the break room, which is tucked at the back of the bank. He started eating his lunch and watching some YouTube videos on his phone, but everything changed when about 30 minutes later he heard 2 loud bangs. At first, Benjamin thought they might be fireworks, but it quickly hit him they were gunshots. He glanced at the security monitor briefly but didn't see anything alarming, as the screen rotates between different cameras and the incident wasn't showing at that moment. Just as he was still scanning the monitor, another round of gunshots rang out. That's when Benjamin knew something was terribly wrong. He quickly exited the building through the rear door, leaving his phone behind. With no way to contact anyone, he sprinted through a wooded area behind the Sunrust Bank and ran to the nearest house. The first house he reached didn't help, but he made it to the second one on Tubbs Road, where the residents called the police for him. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. He ran down here and he's about to pass out. Okay, so where is the man that did the shooting? I don't know. Okay, do you have a description of him? Into the door. I do have a description of the Person who was doing the shooting, he heard it and he ran. Okay, the person works at the bank, right? Okay, did he come to? Okay, so the person that came to you worked at the bank, yeah, and he's a teller. Aside from the call made by the employee, there was actually one other 911 call in addition to the one made by Victor Sparks, but by the time that call came in, the conversation with Zephan had already ended. After Zephan's call ended, the SWAT team quickly rushed to the scene, prepared for a potential standoff. However, the crisis negotiator was still on the line with Zephan. In a tense and delicate moment, she worked tirelessly to talk him down for an hour. Miraculously, her calm and steady voice reached him. Through patience and persuasion, she managed to convince Zephan to drop the gun. That's okay, so you have a vest on. And I know you have your gun. So can you put the gun down, at least on the desk? At least on the desk. You don't have to put it away, but at least you can put it on the desk. Can you do that for me so it's not in your hand? Can you do that for me? What? I can't understand you. Can you talk a little bit louder? I can only hear something about keeping quiet. Oh, it keeps the voices quiet. Oh, I understand. Okay, so having the gun in your hand keeps the voices quiet. Oh, having the gun to your head keeps the voices quiet. Okay, at this point they had been talking for almost 40 minutes. She continued speaking to him, keeping him calm, until the SWAT team finally arrived and was able to take him into custody. With that, the terrifying ordeal came to an end. By this time, the news about the crime had already spread like wildfire, and people couldn't stop talking. Everyone was asking, why would a young man do something so extreme with no obvious reason, like trying to rob the bank? Did he know the victims? Was there some kind of personal grudge or fight that led to this? Well, as it turns out, the answer is no. While Zephan did make a transaction at the bank just 4 days before the shooting, withdrawing $600, there's no evidence that he knew the victims. In fact, during a call with the crisis negotiator, Zephan even mentioned that he was treated well by the employee at the bank, so he wasn't there for a robbery and there was no hidden motive behind his actions. He was just a young man with a troubled past, and that leaves us with one lingering question: could this have been prevented? Born on the 2nd of April 1997, Zephan told authorities he was originally from Plymouth, Indiana, but had only been in Sebring for less than a year. He described himself as the child of divorced parents, a fact he believed shaped him in ways he couldn't fully explain. On top of that, school was never his strong suit. He attended classes in both Plymouth and Bremen, Indiana, but never made it to graduation. His struggles with behavior and mental health derailed any chance of finishing high school, according to police reports. When Zephan was around 15, he climbed onto the roof of his father's house and harmed himself. That was his first trip to a psychiatric hospital, but his battle with darkness had started years before that. In an interview with investigators, he admitted that ever since he was 11 he had been hearing voices, not just whispers but full-blown commands urging him to hurt, to kill, and this wasn't the first time he had obeyed them. Back in high school, Zephan once attacked a student completely unprovoked. That assault got him admitted to a psychiatric hospital, but only for a week. Apparently he never told the doctors about the voices, so he was released and life moved on until that tragic day. Now, there's been a lot of speculation that this whole situation happened because Zephan had broken up with his girlfriend. At the time, rumors say he allegedly texted her before the shooting, just before he killed everyone. The police later reached out to question his ex-girlfriend Alexander Gerlach. Gerlach explained that the two had met at the mental hospital when Zephan was first admitted. Both of them had been admitted twice to the same hospital for depression. Even back then, Gerlach admitted that Zephan had thoughts of self-harm. Gerlach shared that even after their second stay at the psychiatric hospital, Zephan continued to make self-harm statements. She said she made him promise not to take his own life, but from that moment on, Zephan seemed to have a shift in his thinking. He once said, "If I can't kill myself, then I want to kill others." And he became a very angry person. Gerlach said she didn't understand where all that anger came from. Zephan would tell her that he had dreams of killing people, and one day he shared a dream where he heard his classmates. He even told a counselor at his high school about it, and as a result, he was kicked out. Gerlach mentioned that this possibly happened in either 2014 or 2015, but she couldn't remember if anything similar happened at school again after that. Gerlach also mentioned that Zeffin later joined the military in 2016 but was discharged shortly after. She recalled Zeffin telling her he had joined because he thought I can kill people and get away with it. She went on to say that Zeffin was kicked out of the military after he had threatened to kill another soldier in his squad. He then became a correctional officer trainee with the Florida Department of Corrections at the Avon Park Correctional Institution. However, he resigned from this position on January 9, 2019, just a few weeks before the tragic murder took place. According to Gerlach, her contact with Zeffin became very limited after he was discharged from the military. However, a week after the shooting took place, Gerlach mentioned that she was private messaging Zeffin on Instagram. He sent her a photo of a handgun he had recently purchased. Gerlach asked why he bought the firearm, and Zeffin simply replied, "Because I just wanted one." When asked about the specifics of the handgun, Gerlach admitted she couldn't remember much about it. She said that was the last time she spoke to Zeffin. As for the man himself, he didn't hold anything back when talking to the police. Zeffin was eerily cooperative, almost as if he wanted to lay everything out. He admitted that he had purchased the handgun just 2 days before the shooting, but on the day of the murders something felt different. The voices in his head weren't just there, they were louder than ever, overwhelming, demanding, and impossible to ignore. At the time, his mother was away in Illinois for a week-long work training, leaving him completely alone at home. Zeffin, however, did contact one of his ex-girlfriends, but it was not Gerlach, it was his other ex, Imani Davis. Davis, who had known Zeffin from a long-distance, mostly online relationship, later testified about their past. She revealed that they had met when she was still in high school, and their relationship had been marked by dark, heavy conversations. They had talked about attempting self-harm together, diving deep into discussions of death and despair. They would spend hours, sometimes even days, on the phone, wrapped up in these troubling topics. But by May of 2018 their relationship had ended and they stopped speaking altogether. That was until January 23, 2019, the day of the shooting. Out of the blue, Zeffin messaged her. At first he seemed unusually happy, almost excited, something that was completely out of character for him. Then at exactly 12:14 in the afternoon, when Zeffin was still in his car in the bank's parking lot, Davis received a message that made her blood run cold. The fun part, the cliche clincher, the message read, is that I'm not going out alone, I'm taking a few people out with me because I've always wanted to kill people, so I'm going to try it and see how it goes. Watch out for me on the news. Sebring, Florida. Davis was horrified. She responded immediately, "There's something wrong with you, seriously." But she didn't stop there. Realizing how serious the situation was, she immediately showed the messages to her gym teacher, since she was in gym class at the time. From there the situation quickly escalated. The school principal and psychiatrist got involved, and law enforcement in both her area and Sebring were contacted, but by then it was too late. According to reports, Zeffin entered the bank with a smile on his face, approaching the teller before suddenly pointing the gun at her. There was even another witness who claimed to have locked eyes with Zeffin in the parking lot just moments before the shooting. "What can you tell me in your own words? You're involved." "I pulled in back, the door got out, there was a white male in the car, we actually made eye contact, didn't think anything of it, went in the bank, made 2 transactions, talked to Marisol about being locked out of my Sunrust account. I can't tell you how long I was in there. I came back out, he was still sitting in the car, we made eye contact again, kind of thought it was a little weird, he was sitting there still. Went about my business, went to McDonald's, went back to work, got on Facebook and realized that this had happened, and I actually described him to my boss." Okay, when the case went to trial, Zeffin faced 5 counts of first-degree murder. In March 2023 he pleaded guilty to all charges. The prosecution pushed for the death penalty, and in June 2024, the jury recommended it by a vote of 9-3. On December 16, 2024, Zeffin was sentenced to death. Judge Angela Sen highlighted the premeditated nature of his actions and the deep impact on the victims' families and the community. We, the jury, find by a vote of 9-3 that Zeffin Allen Xavier should be sentenced to death. It's the verdict the state attorney's office pushed for, with support from the families of Cynthia Watson, Jessica Montague, Marisol Lopez, Deborah Cook and Anna Pignon Williams. The loss of these 5 lives left a lasting scar on their families. Marisol Lopez's daughter, for example, spoke out about the deep void left in her life. It was actually Lopez who was the first to face Zeffen's gun when he entered the bank despite the tragic circumstances. She was remembered for always bringing positivity to those around her. Marisol, a mother of 2 young children, will forever be missed by her family and everyone who knew her. Then there was Anna Pignon Williams, a 38-year-old mother of 7. Just like Marisol, Anna was a dedicated employee at the bank and loved her job. Her devotion to her children and her work made her a strong and resilient figure. The grief her family felt from her sudden loss was profound, and the community around Sebring mourned alongside them. Jessica Montague, 31, also worked as a teller at Sunrust Bank. A loving mother to 5 children and a wife to her husband Jermaine, Jessica had been planning to celebrate her wedding anniversary just days before the shooting. The couple's 3-year-old child was left without a mother, a loss too great for words. A friend described Jessica as a woman full of life, someone who could always be counted on to brighten up a room, and it's no doubt that her untimely death shattered her family and left a void that could never be filled. Deborah Cook, 54, was another victim, a native of California. She had been married to her husband Michael since 1984. Deborah had worked at the bank for many years, where she was known for her dedication and kindness. She is survived by her 2 sons, a granddaughter, a grandson, and a daughter-in-law, all of whom carry on her memory. Her family remembers her as a loving and supportive woman who had a heart of gold. Lastly, there was Cynthia Watson, 65, who was a customer at the bank. That day, Cynthia had recently married her longtime partner Tony Watson. Just weeks before the shooting, they had been together for 5 years before tying the knot on January 3, 2019, living in Venus, Florida, with their pets including 2 shoes, chickens and goats. Cynthia was remembered by friends as a passionate animal lover. Now, the reason we mentioned that this tragedy truly caught everyone off guard is because on the outside Zeffen seemed like someone who was perfectly ordinary. Nothing about him gave off the vibe of a person capable of such violence. In the neighborhood of Sebring, he was known as a well-mannered young man with a job and what appeared to be a passion for life. People knew him as someone who had a routine, someone who blended in without raising any red flags. In fact, one of his neighbors even spoke out in an interview describing Zeffen as someone who seemed incapable of committing such a horrendous act. She says while Zeffen would often hang out in his room playing video games, he also made time to be nice to her daughter. As of now, 27-year-old Zeffen is detained at Florida State Prison, where he remains on death row. Story 2. I have never heard anything as bad as the Kapunda triple murder. There is simply no comparison. I mean, like, they were just good people. I just don't understand why someone would do this. This question haunts us every time a murder leaves the world in shock, and this case is no exception. In fact, it's even more disturbing in the normally peaceful town of Kapunda, where crime is almost unheard of. Something unspeakable happened, and trust me when I say even the most hardened investigators called this one of the most savage, blood-soaked cases a jury had ever seen. It was so brutal that when the killer was finally caught, the grieving family had just one thing to say: I hope he goes to hell. I don't give a _ what happens to him. So what really happened for them to say this, and could this be a case where a life should be on the table? I'll leave that question for you to answer by the end of this video. In the meantime, let's get to know the victims first. For this case, let's take a step back to the fall of 2010 to a small tranquil town in South Australia called Kapunda, with a population of just 3,000 people. It sat peacefully near the Light River in the Barassa Valley, a place where the world seemed to move a little slower. Here in the heart of this quiet town, the Rowe family was living. There lives the head of the family. Andrew Rowe was born in England in 1965, but when he was just 3 years old, Andrew and his parents packed up and moved to Australia, where they decided to put down roots. They settled in a quiet suburb of Adelaide, and it was there that Andrew grew up. As a kid, he was known for his friendly personality, his great sense of humor, and his love for fishing with his dad. He was the kind of guy you'd want as a neighbor, always smiling and willing to lend a hand as he Got older. Andrew's path crossed with a young woman named Rose. She was a cheerful, vibrant spirit, just a year younger than him. They met while Andrew was studying in Adelaide, and it didn't take long for sparks to fly there. Relationship quickly blossomed into something serious. In 1985 the two of them married in a small ceremony surrounded by close friends and family, just the kind of intimate celebration they both wanted. 2 years later, in 1987, Andrew and Rose welcomed their first child, a son they named Christopher. Their family was complete when in 1994 they had their second child, a beautiful daughter named Chantel. Life in Kapunda seemed perfect. Andrew and Rose decided to start their own carpet cleaning business, and the business quickly thrived, providing the family with financial stability. By the summer of 2010, Christopher, now 23, had moved out of the family home and was living with his girlfriend just a few blocks away. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Chantel had started working part-time as a waitress at a local roadside cafe, juggling work with school, but life wasn't always smooth sailing. Around this time, Chantel faced a big challenge. She discovered she was pregnant at such a young age, and with her boyfriend Dylan by her side, she was faced with many obstacles. However, Chantel wasn't one to back down. Despite the hardships, she was determined to give her baby the best life possible, and though she was only 16, she had an unwavering support system. Dylan, her boyfriend, stood by her every step of the way, offering his love and commitment. Her friends too were there for her, ready to offer their help and encouragement. No matter what, life in the Rowe family was for the most part good. There were challenges, of course, but there was also love, hope, and a sense of family. That is, until the night of November 7, 2010, the night that would change everything. It was midnight when an intruder broke into the Rowe family home and brutally murdered them in a way so savage it shocked even the most experienced detectives from Adelaide. Inside the house looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Blood was everywhere, on the floor, walls, curtains, and even the ceiling. But it wasn't until 2 days later that anyone noticed something was terribly wrong. The neighbors, who hadn't seen any movement from the family in days, started peeking through the windows, and what they found was horrifying. The bodies of 45-year-old Andrew and 44-year-old Rose were discovered in the kitchen, horribly disfigured, while Chantel's body was found in her bedroom, torn apart. Each family member had suffered multiple stab wounds and had been dead for days before the police arrived. At the time of the murders, Christopher, the eldest son, was away on vacation with his fiancée in Queensland. When word of the horrific crime started to spread, he heard that dead bodies had been found on the very street where his family lived. In a panic, he rushed to ask anyone he could on Facebook for more details, desperately trying to confirm the terrible news. What made the situation even worse was that he couldn't get in touch with his family. Initially, he was told it wasn't his parents, but soon after the police confirmed his worst nightmare, they broke the heartbreaking news to him over the phone. When the autopsy results were revealed, it shattered Christopher even more. The total number of stab wounds was staggering, around 112 in total. His father Andrew had been stabbed 29 times, his mother Rose more than 50 times, and his sister Chantel 33 times. The worst part, Chantel had been assaulted before her life was brutally taken, leaving Christopher with an unthinkable amount of grief and loss. But as strange as it sounds, the first person suspected of the crime was Christopher himself, mainly because he was the only surviving family member at the time. However, he was ruled out as a suspect immediately, as he was the first to raise the alarm when he couldn't get in touch with his family. Once he heard the devastating news, he quickly flew back home. His alibi and fingerprints were checked, confirming he was across the continent when the murders occurred. So who could have been twisted enough to murder 3 adults in such a brutal way? The Rowe family was well liked in their town, with no known enemies who would have wanted to harm them. At this point, people were desperate for answers, especially Chantel's friends. Why would someone attack a pregnant teenager? The brutality of the crime was horrifying enough, but then an eerie detail surfaced that made it even more disturbing. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Investigators pieced together that after the murders, the killer had calmly changed into clean clothes and laid down on Chantel's bed, bloody drag marks near The bed revealed that Chantel had desperately tried to hide, but the killer had dragged her out, refusing to let her escape. Additionally, nothing was stolen. Valuables like phones, a laptop, an expensive camera, and even cash were left untouched in plain sight. This ruled out robbery as a motive. The sheer brutality of the attack also suggested that more than one person might have been involved, as it would have been difficult for a single individual to overpower three adults. Alternatively, the perpetrator could have been a physically strong man. Investigators also noticed that the suspect had clumsily attempted to clean the crime scene, wiping away footprints in some areas before abandoning the effort. Bloody shoe prints led to the door, but then suddenly stopped, implying that the killer may have removed his shoes and left in socks to avoid leaving more evidence. Even more chilling, there were no signs of forced entry, meaning the family likely knew the killer and willingly let him inside, or he had found another way to enter. Now, as mentioned earlier, forensic experts confirmed that Chantel had been sexually assaulted before her death, making the crime even more twisted and deeply personal. But the most gut-wrenching revelation was about Rose, the mother. She had been stabbed more than 50 times, far more than Chantel or Andrew, the reason she had survived the first attack and managed to call for help. But before she could get assistance, the killer realized she was still alive and came back for her, stabbing her repeatedly until she could no longer fight back. With all this being said, the police began to look at every possible suspect, but after confirming that the parents had no enemies or personal issues that could have led to this horrifying crime, they quickly shifted their focus to their 16-year-old daughter Chantel. Chantel and her boyfriend Dylan had been together for a year, and with a baby on the way, they were both still attending the same school like Chantel. Dylan was only 16, and at first glance he didn't seem capable of such a horrific crime, but the police had to be thorough. They needed to question him, check his alibi, and see if he had any idea who might have wanted to hurt Chantel or her family. Dylan was more than willing to cooperate. Heartbroken, he told investigators about his loving relationship with Chantel and how they had even talked about getting married in the future. He was devastated by her death and struggling to process what had happened. At the time of the murders, Dylan was in a nearby city attending his grandfather's anniversary, and his alibi was rock solid. Dozens of witnesses confirmed his whereabouts, officially ruling him out as a suspect. Despite having few solid leads, the police did have one major advantage: the killer's DNA and fingerprints. They had extracted seminal fluid from Chantel's body, which could be the key to identifying the murderer, but when they ran it through their database, there was no match, meaning whoever did this had no prior criminal record. Another chilling detail emerged: the murderer had used knives from the family's own kitchen. This hinted that the attack might not have been planned in advance, but was instead an impulsive act of extreme violence. To make things even harder for investigators, the killer took the murder weapons with him, leaving behind almost no physical evidence. Forensic experts estimated the time of death between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning. A neighbor later admitted to hearing Rose scream for help twice around 1:00, followed by a loud thud. Unfortunately, they assumed it was just a domestic dispute and didn't call the police. No one reported seeing any strangers near the house that night, and officers carefully combed the area searching for clues or the missing weapons, hoping for a breakthrough. The police turned to the public, asking anyone with information to come forward. Tips poured in, but most were either misleading or completely false, making the investigation even more frustrating. Hoping for a breakthrough, police turned to the public, urging anyone with information to come forward. Calls flooded in, but most were dead ends, false leads, wild theories, and outright hoaxes. The frustration grew, but then Dylan shared something that sent chills down investigators' spines. He remembered that on Sunday night Chantel wasn't feeling well. She had developed a fever and even called her boss to say she'd be missing work the next morning at exactly 5:00. Dylan sent her a text to check in. His message was read, but there was no reply. What he didn't know was that by then Chantel and her parents were already dead. The person who had read his message wasn't her, it was the killer. Then came an even more disturbing twist. Police discovered the murderer had actually tried to respond to Dylan's text, but Chantel's phone was out of credit. It was a failed attempt to fake her being alive. With this eerie Revelation detectives dug deeper, focusing on Chantel's circle and anyone with a potential grudge. That's when they stumbled upon Jason Alexander Downey, a 17-year-old who was close with Dylan but barely knew Chantel. At first Jason didn't seem like a threat. He was average height, thin, and appeared harmless. Police initially planned to ask him a few questions and move on, but as the interview progressed his behavior took a strange turn. Instead of answering questions directly, he grew more nervous, raising the detective's suspicions. He complained about not being invited to Chantel's party and pointed out that everyone else had a partner even though it wasn't relevant to the case. Then he suddenly claimed to have an alibi for the night of the murders. A statement no one had even asked for. This erratic behavior only intensified the police's suspicions, prompting them to take his fingerprints and DNA. To their surprise, Jason cooperated calmly, showing little anxiety, something that made them briefly question if their suspicions were wrong. But the truth came out when experts examined his fingerprints. They noticed fresh, deep cuts on Jason's palms, and though he claimed they were from a machine shop accident, the cuts looked too clean and precise, as if made by something sharp. But then the smoking gun emerged. The fingerprints found on Chantel's bedroom door matched Jason's, and within just 2 days the DNA results confirmed what everyone had been dreading. Jason Downey was responsible for the brutal murders. Contrary to what police first assumed, that the killer had to be big and strong to take down 3 adults, Jason was actually thin and looked completely harmless, a chilling reminder that you should never judge a book by its cover. He even managed to deceive many people, even those closest to him, when the family's relatives and friends gathered to pay their respects. Jason was seen on local news laying flowers for the family, looking every bit the part of a grieving friend. Born in Killarney, Scotland, Jason had moved to with his mother and older brother Jamie. On the surface his background seemed normal enough, but beneath it all there was a dark side to Jason that only he and Chantel truly knew. As it turns out, Chantel had always been polite to Jason, but their connection was nothing special. She didn't dislike him, but she didn't really like him either. He was just part of the group, someone she tolerated out of necessity. The thing was, Jason didn't take rejection well. She had turned down his advances multiple times, but instead of accepting it, Jason's feelings began to morph into something darker, more dangerous. And when he found out that Chantel was pregnant with Dylan's baby, it was like a switch flipped in his mind. The thought of his friend Dylan being the father, not him, sent Jason into a jealousy-fueled rage. That rage came to a head on the night of November 7th, but there's a dark twist to his reasoning. Jason wasn't just angry at Dylan, it wasn't even about him as much as it was about Chantel. The jealousy and obsession had reached a boiling point, and the night would mark the beginning of something tragic. When Jason was first questioned about the murders after his arrest, his calm demeanor shocked the detectives. He denied everything with unsettling ease, trying to talk his way out of the evidence piling up against him. He claimed that his fingerprints at the Rowe family home weren't from the night of the murders, but from a visit a month and a half earlier. A simple slip up, right? Except when the police dug deeper, they found that his DNA was on Chantel's body. Jason tried to play it off, making up an outlandish story that during that same visit he and Chantel had been intimate, but here's where his lies fell apart. The forensic evidence, it proved that the DNA found on Chantel couldn't have stayed on her body for that long. It was impossible. That lie was just another nail in his coffin. Jason's confession revealed a disturbing series of events that painted a chilling picture of the night. After a heated argument with his mother and stepfather, Jason decided to sleep in his car, but that's when things took a turn. He found out from Dylan that Chantel was homesick, and suddenly Jason's obsession hit a whole new level. What started as a plan to simply drive by and glance at her house morphed into something far more sinister. So Jason parked his car at the end of the street out of sight and walked toward the Rowe family home. The house was dark, the windows all closed. But there was one window, the bathroom window, slightly ajar. Being the thin, nimble guy he was, Jason squeezed right through it without hesitation. Once inside, he sat quietly in the bathroom for about 30 minutes, just listening, waiting for the house to settle, ensuring that everyone was asleep. Now Jason claims his initial plan was to confess his feelings to Chantel, but let's be real, why would he grab a kitchen knife before entering her room? Investigators Knew right away this wasn't just some awkward confession. Jason had far darker intentions. Police believed that he was going to threaten her, to control her in the twisted way his obsession demanded. When he finally entered Chantel's room, she resisted his advances, and that's when everything snapped. Her rejection triggered a violent fury in him, and in that moment Jason didn't hold back. He brutally stabbed her over and over. The screams from Chantel woke her parents, Andrew and Rose, who rushed to protect their daughter, but Jason, now fully consumed by rage, turned on them as well, stabbing both Andrew and Rose to death in a frenzy. In his confession, Jason claimed he acted out of an uncontrollable passion, but the cold, calculated nature of his actions painted a different picture. This whole picture suggested premeditation rather than a spur-of-the-moment crime. As the investigation progressed, more damning evidence surfaced, further tightening the noose around Jason. A pair of blood-stained shoes were discovered, discarded in a deserted area. The blood on them matched the DNA of all three victims, and the prints from the soles matched the bloody footprints found at the crime scene. Inside the shoes, traces of Jason's sweat were also found, implicating him even further despite his attempts to cooperate, like promising to show investigators where he had disposed of the knives. The murder weapons were never recovered. This led detectives to believe that Jason was still trying to manipulate the situation. Even as the evidence piled up against him, the trial of Jason Downey finally came in the fall of 2011, nearly a year after the murders. Throughout the trial he remained cold and emotionless, frequently changing his testimony and showing no remorse for his actions. He continued to claim he had no memory of killing the Rowe family, even though his actions told a much darker story. One chilling detail that emerged during the trial was that after the massacre, Jason took Chantel's pendant and chain, a piece of her he kept even after her death. During the trial, Jason even argued that the tragedy could have been avoided if Chantel had simply invited him to the party she had hosted before her death. It was clear, though, that his deep feelings of rejection and obsession with her had pushed him to commit this unspeakable act. Throughout the proceedings, Jason maintained a calm, indifferent demeanor. When he finally pleaded guilty, it was an attempt to secure a lighter sentence. He later admitted to his brother that this was his reasoning to avoid life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Hateful things went through your mind, Downey refusing to even glance their way. I just don't think he shows any remorse for what he's done. Even police, stunned at the sheer savagery of the crime and the killer's attitude since his guilty plea, shouldn't be seen as any sign of remorse on his part for three murders that I think are unrivaled in their cruel and savage nature. On April 19, 2012, Jason Downey was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 35 years. Had he not pleaded guilty, he would have had to serve at least 45 years before even being eligible for parole. He even wrote a letter addressed to Chantel's family and friends stating he was sorry and that he deserved whatever punishment came his way. But when you take a closer look at Jason's letter, it's hard to ignore the sense that there's no genuine remorse behind his words. It almost feels like a forced apology, like a boy who was made to write it rather than someone who truly regrets his actions. Chantel's brother Christopher Rowe, who tragically lost his entire family, expressed that while he believed the sentence was just, no punishment could ever heal the pain of losing his loved ones. To honor their memory, Christopher had their names tattooed on his body, a permanent tribute to the family he lost. In one interview, Christopher couldn't even bring himself to speak directly to the press, so he let his cousin speak on his behalf. After the tragedy, he took 6 months off work and left Cape Under, retreating from the world. When he returned, he could barely keep interest in his work. However, he eventually took over his dad's carpet cleaning business, changing the name from First Choice Carpet Cleaning to Rose Choice Carpet Cleaning, a way to keep his family's legacy alive while rebuilding his own life. As for Jason, he remains at the Moreland Juvenile Detention Centre in South Australia, still serving his sentence. Now I want to pose this question. Story 3. In March 1994, the bodies of these 4 young women were discovered in a chillingly similar way. Each one had been brutally assaulted and strangled to death in their own homes, the very place they should have felt safe. When investigators finally tracked down their suspect, they uncovered a cold-blooded murderer who would go down in history as the first known African-American serial killer, and those 4 women they were just the beginning. Serial killer is shocking enough, but Bad Henry, as the show is called, profiles the man who's known as America's first African-American serial killer. He was accused in 90 killings, convicted of 9. Right here in Charlotte, and wait until you hear the connection between all of his victims between 1990 and 1994. At least 10 black women were found dead, all killed in the same horrifying way, but the police failed to connect the dots. Whether it was carelessness or something worse, they let the bodies pile up while the killer kept hunting. In fact, he wasn't hiding, he was right there, even known to some of his victims, and it took 4 long years before he was finally caught. And it makes you wonder, if the police had done their job sooner, how many could have been saved. She passed out. That man was Henry Louis Wallace, casually detailing how he ended the lives of his victims like it was nothing. But before we uncover why he did it and how he managed to stay undetected for so long, let's first get to know the women he was talking about, starting with Caroline Love. Caroline Love was 20 years old in the summer of 1992, working as a cashier at Bojangles. She had been at the job for more than 2 years, earning a reputation as a hard-working and reliable employee. Born and raised in Charlotte, she had always been driven. She ran track in junior high, graduated from Garinger High School, and later enrolled at Central Piedmont Community College to study nursing. By June of that year, Caroline Love was living with her best friend Sadie McKnight, who also happened to be Henry's longtime girlfriend. They shared an apartment at Darby Terrace on Central Avenue, just a few blocks from the Bojangles restaurant where they both worked. On the night of June 15th, Caroline finished her shift and asked her manager to exchange a $10 bill for a roll of quarters so she could do laundry. He handed her the quarters and she left the restaurant just after midnight. No one knew it then, but that was the last time anyone would ever see her alive. That night, Henry was already inside the apartment waiting. He had a spare key and let himself in, knowing Sadie wasn't home yet. When Caroline walked through the door, he greeted her with a smile, acting like he belonged there. Then, without warning, he leaned in and kissed her on the cheek. Caroline was in complete shock. Just like anyone would be in her shoes. It wasn't just that Henry kissed her, it was because he was her best friend's boyfriend. Trying to keep things from getting worse, she told him that as long as he never did it again, she'd let it go and wouldn't tell Sadie. But Henry wasn't about to take no for an answer. In an instant, his friendly demeanor vanished. Before Caroline could even process what was happening, he lunged at her, his hands tightening around her throat. She gasped, struggling to break free, but he was too strong. He forced her into her bedroom, pinned her down, and assaulted her. She fought back with everything she had, but her resistance only fueled his rage. Determined to silence her forever, he grabbed a curling iron, wrapped the cord around her neck, and pulled until she stopped breathing. At this point, Caroline was gone. Now he had to cover his tracks. He grabbed Caroline's bed sheets and quickly wrapped her lifeless body, then stuffed her inside a large orange trash bag. With no hesitation, he dragged her out of the apartment and into his car. But before leaving, he went back inside, scanning the room for anything he could take to make it seem like she had simply disappeared. That's when he spotted the roll of quarters she had gotten earlier that night. He grabbed it, locked the door behind him, and walked away as if nothing had happened. The night was dark and quiet as Henry drove through the streets, looking for a place where no one would find her. Eventually, he reached a secluded area. Without a second thought, he pulled over, dragged Caroline's body from the car, and dumped her into a ditch. Then, just like that, he got back in and drove away. Hours later, Sadie came home completely unaware of the horror that had just unfolded in her apartment. Everything seemed normal at first until she got a call from Caroline's sister, Kathy. There was worry in her voice. She hadn't heard from Caroline all day, and when she called Bojangles, she learned that Caroline had never shown up for work. Caroline was responsible, always on time, so this was totally unlike her. At first, Sadie tried to stay calm, but as the minutes passed with no sign of Caroline, concern quickly turned into panic. Desperate for answers, Kathy, and even Henry went to the police station to file a missing person report, hoping someone could help them find her. When the police arrived at the apartment to investigate, it was immediately clear that something was off. Caroline's bed sheets were Missing the furniture looked like it had been moved, almost as if there had been a struggle. The roll of quarters she had gotten the night before had also vanished, yet there was no sign she had gone to do laundry. Her hamper was still full, but despite all the red flags, the case was treated as a simple missing person report. There was no real investigation, no deeper look into what had actually happened that night. Time passed and eventually people began to move on. At this point Henry thought he was untouchable. He had already gotten away with Caroline's murder and his violent urges were only growing stronger, but he wasn't some outcast hiding away in the shadows. In fact, Henry had a decent social life. He was a well-liked manager at Taco Bell where he built relationships with his employees. One of them was Shauna Hawk, a bright young woman juggling college and work, completely unaware that her boss was hiding a deadly secret. 7 months after Caroline vanished on the afternoon of February 17, 1993, Henry showed up at Shauna's home. When she heard the doorbell, she had no reason to be suspicious. After all, it was just Henry. She let him in, and for about an hour they talked like normal co-workers. At one point she even joked with him about the problems he was having with his girlfriend City. Everything seemed fine, but as their conversation wrapped up and Shauna walked Henry to the door, his entire demeanor changed in an instant. Without warning, Henry told Shauna he wanted to sleep with her, but it wasn't a suggestion, it was a demand. According to Henry, Shauna gave in and they went to her bedroom, but after it was over things took an even darker turn. He ordered her to get dressed and go into the bathroom. She complied, probably too scared to argue, but once she stepped inside, Henry followed, wrapping his hands around her throat. Just like Caroline, she fought back with everything she had, but Henry was just too strong. As soon as she lost consciousness, he filled the bathtub with water and placed her inside. Then, as if he had just finished running an errand, he took $50 from her purse and left, completely unfazed by what he had just done. By the time Shauna was found, it was too late. It's safe to say that the police investigation was a disaster. Despite questioning Shauna's friends and family, they came up with nothing. No real leads, no real suspects, just another young woman gone without justice. And Henry, he had no reason to be worried. A few days after the murder, Shauna's funeral was held, and in a sickening twist, Henry himself showed up to pay his respects. He stood among the mourners pretending to grieve like everyone else, but no one was more devastated than Shauna's mother. She was the one who found her daughter lifeless in the bathtub, a moment that would haunt her forever. Her only child gone in the most brutal way imaginable. She then wrote a public letter pleading with the unknown killer to come forward, hoping that somehow her words might reach the monster who took her daughter away. Dear killer, I am the mother of Shauna and Denise Hawk. I'm writing to you because you murdered my only daughter in our home on February 19, 1993, between the hours of 1 p.m. to 5:00 p.m. I find it so hard to believe that an entire year has gone by since that horrible Friday evening when Shauna's dead body was discovered in the bathtub where you put her. But Henry didn't care. In fact, this wouldn't be the last time he killed a co-worker. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Months after taking Shauna's life, he struck again, and this time his target was another one of his Taco Bell employees, a 24-year-old woman named Audrey Spain. Audrey had just returned home from a vacation, probably feeling relaxed and happy, completely unaware that a monster was about to enter her life. Just like before, Henry used his charm to talk his way inside. He made it seem casual, just a friendly visit, nothing out of the ordinary. They sat down and had a conversation just like he had done with Shauna, and just like before, Audrey had no reason to be afraid, but the moment she let her guard down, Henry flipped. Without hesitation, he grabbed her and forced her to the ground. This time it wasn't just about control. It was about money. Henry was desperate for cash, and he demanded that Audrey give him the combination to the safe at Taco Bell. He needed money for crack, and his addiction had driven him to a new level of violence. But there was one problem. Audrey didn't know the combination. She told him over and over that she didn't have the answer he was looking for, but Henry didn't believe her. His frustration turned into pure rage, and his aggression escalated the more she insisted she didn't know. The angrier he became, and then, just like before, his fury turned deadly in his growing rage. Henry did what had now become second nature. He wrapped his hands around Audrey's throat and squeezed it until she passed out. Afterwards, Henry dragged Audrey to her bedroom and violated her just like what he did to Caroline and Shauna. Once he was finished, he strangled her to death, then calmly washed her body off in the shower as if trying to erase the horror he had just inflicted. He placed her lifeless body on her bed, stole her credit card and walked out as if nothing had happened. When Audrey's lifeless body was found 3 days later, an investigation was launched, but for reasons unknown, the police and detectives once again failed to connect the dots. The similarities were obvious. Both Shauna and Audrey were young women in their early 20s. Both were murdered in their homes. Both worked at the same Taco Bell and both were strangled, yet somehow this didn't raise any red flags, and because of this failure, Henry saw no reason to stop. His next target was 21-year-old college student Valencia Jumper. Valencia, a bright and ambitious young woman from Columbia, South Carolina, had a connection to Henry. She was friends with his sister. They had spent time together before, so when Henry showed up at her door, she had no reason to be suspicious. On August 10, 1993, Henry knocked on Valencia's door, spinning a familiar story. He told her that he had just had a terrible fight with his girlfriend Sadie and needed someone to talk to. Being kind and understanding, Valencia let him in. Without hesitation, Henry and Valencia had a long conversation. She was offering him some advice, talking to him about whatever was going on, but after they spoke for a while, Henry convinced Valencia to call Sadie and let her know where he was. When she got up to make the call, though, things took a dark turn. Henry's dangerous side, the one nobody saw coming, took over, and he switched to his true violent nature. In a flash, he grabbed Valencia and put her in a chokehold. She struggled, but it didn't take long before she lost consciousness. When she was completely out, Henry dragged her to the bedroom, and that's where things went from bad to worse. He did things to her that no one should ever have to experience, and when he was done, he made sure she wouldn't wake up. He strangled her with a towel, but this time Henry didn't follow the same pattern as before. Instead of leaving her body in the bathtub like his previous victims, he did something far more twisted. He filled the bathtub with rum, not water. It was a strange and disturbing choice, but Henry wasn't done yet. He then took her body and placed it inside the tub. Once that was done, he casually walked to the kitchen, turned on the stove, and put a can of pork and beans on high heat. Before leaving the house, Henry made sure he covered every trace. He ripped the smoke detector off the ceiling, removed its batteries, and struck a match, setting it on fire. He made sure to leave behind no evidence of what he had done. The fire quickly grew, burning everything in its way. When Valencia's body was finally discovered, the flames had already done their work. The official report said she died from thermal burns. It seemed like just another tragic incident, but if anyone had taken a deeper look, they might have uncovered the truth, because let's be real, a thorough investigation and a proper autopsy would have shown what Henry had done. But once again the authorities failed. Another woman had been killed. Another crime scene was botched, and Henry walked away free and unnoticed, ready to carry on his twisted ways. A few days after killing Valencia, Henry had the audacity to attend her funeral, standing among mourners as if he hadn't been the one responsible for her death. He even went with his sister, blending in with the grieving crowd. But Henry wasn't done. Just 5 weeks later, he struck again, this time targeting a mother. On September 15, 1993, Henry set his sights on Michelle Stinson, another co-worker from Taco Bell. That night he went to her home, and when he arrived, Michelle welcomed him inside. The two of them sat and talked for a while, having what seemed like a normal conversation. By then Michelle's kids were already fast asleep in their bedrooms, completely unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. As their conversation came to an end, Henry suddenly hugged Michelle and told her he wanted to be intimate with her, but Michelle wasn't interested. She told him she wasn't feeling well. That should have been the end of it, but as mentioned earlier, Henry wasn't willing to take no for an answer. Instead, he got angry and demanded to see all the medications she was supposedly taking. He searched for prescriptions but found nothing, and that was all it took for his frustration to explode right there in the middle of the kitchen floor. Henry overpowered Michelle and took advantage of her, but that wasn't enough for him. When he was done, he tried to strangle her with a towel, just like he had done to Valencia, but Michelle fought with everything she had. She gasped for air, moaned in pain, and refused to let go of life so easily. Seeing that she was still struggling, Henry grabbed a large kitchen knife and stabbed her multiple times in the back. In the middle of this horrific attack, Michelle's 3-year-old son suddenly walked into the room. The innocent child had no idea what he was witnessing, but Henry quickly turned to him and ordered him to go back to bed. The boy obeyed, disappearing into his room. While his mother lay bleeding on the floor, once Henry was sure Michelle was dead, he grabbed the towel and the bloody knife, left the apartment, and threw both items over a nearby fence. Before disappearing into the night, the next morning Michelle's children were the ones who found her lifeless body lying in the kitchen. Not long after, a friend stopped by to check on her. When they asked the little boy where his mother was, he simply said, "She's sleeping." He was too young to understand that she would never wake up again. And just like before, the police investigation into Michelle's murder was a disaster. Authorities failed to connect Henry to the crime. In fact, he wasn't even considered a suspect by this point. 5 women had been murdered or gone missing, all within a 5 radius. Fear spread through the community. People were terrified, wondering if they would be next. In response, authorities increased police presence in East Charlotte. Now, sensing the pressure, Henry kept a lower profile for a while, but that didn't mean he stopped his crimes. He was still up to no good, committing smaller offenses while staying out of the spotlight. Early the following year, he fathered a child with a woman who wasn't his girlfriend. Then on February 4, 1994, he was arrested for shoplifting. The police detained him, gave him a court date, and let him go. But when the date came, Henry didn't show up. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but law enforcement barely made an effort to track him down. Once again, Henry slipped through the cracks. By now he felt so untouchable, unlike never before. In his mind, he could do whatever he wanted and never face any consequences, and so it wasn't long before he gave in to his darkest urges. Again on February 20, 1994, Henry knocked on the door of Vanessa Mack, a 25-year-old woman who happened to be the sister of one of his Taco Bell co-workers. He used the same manipulative tactics he had before, chatting casually, gaining her trust and convincing her to let him inside. The moment she did, he turned violent. He dragged her to the bedroom, assaulted her, and then strangled her to death. Before leaving, he stole her bank card, thinking only about his next hit of crack cocaine. The next morning, Vanessa's mother found her daughter's lifeless body. As for the police investigation, well, it went exactly how you'd expect. Investigators failed once again. Vanessa was now the 3rd murder victim connected to the same Taco Bell location, yet authorities still didn't see the pattern. By now, Henry was getting careless, too bold for his own good. His addiction to crack was spiraling out of control, and he was desperate for money. The following string of would unfold in just a short span of time. In fact, within a period of only 3 days. Starting on March 8, 1994, Henry's killing spree would reach new levels of brutality. On March 8, 1994, Henry showed up at the apartment of his friend Bernice Woods. His real plan was to attack and rob Bernice's girlfriend Brandy Henderson, but things didn't go as expected. When Henry knocked on the door, it was Bernice who answered instead of Brandy. Caught off guard, Henry quickly made up a story. He told Bernice that he was leaving town for a while and just wanted to say goodbye. After a short conversation, he left the apartment complex, but Henry wasn't done for the night. As he walked away, he remembered that another person he knew lived in the same complex, Betty Jean Batchame, who worked as an assistant manager at Bojangles alongside his girlfriend City. Since Betty was in a position of authority, Henry assumed she knew the combination to the restaurant safe. Seeing an opportunity, he went straight to her apartment and knocked on the door. When Betty answered, Henry told her he needed to use her phone. Without hesitation, Betty welcomed him inside. While she turned her back to him, Henry pretended to make a call, but the moment she was distracted, he dropped the phone, rushed up behind her, and put her in a chokehold. Betty struggled, but Henry's grip was too strong. He demanded that she give him the safe combination, the restaurant keys, and the alarm code, everything he needed to rob the Bojangles. Betty held out for about 30 minutes, refusing to cooperate, but eventually she gave in. The moment she told him the safe code, Henry loosened his grip and let her go. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of panicking or begging, Betty asked Henry what was Wrong with him. In response, Henry admitted that he was sick. He told her he had hurt many people, but instead of reacting with fear, Betty did something incredibly brave. She forgave him. She even told him he needed to get help, but Henry didn't care. Her words meant nothing to him. The moment she finished speaking, Henry snapped, just like so many before her. Betty suffered the same brutal fate. He dragged her to the bedroom, assaulted her, and then strangled her to death. Before leaving, he robbed her apartment, taking a TV, a VCR, a gold chain, and even her car. He drove straight to a pawn shop, sold everything, and used the money to buy crack. But his killing spree wasn't over yet. Just 12 hours later, Henry returned to the same apartment complex. This time he was determined to finish what he had originally planned. He knew Bernice would be at work, which meant Brandy was home alone with her infant son. Once again he knocked on the door, pretending he had something to drop off for Bernice. Trusting him, Brandy let him inside. As soon as she turned her back, Henry grabbed her in a chokehold and demanded money, but there was barely anything in the apartment, just a Pringles can filled with loose change. Clearly that wasn't enough for him, so he dragged Brandy to the bedroom, assaulted her, and then strangled her to death. Then something unexpected happened. The baby started crying uncontrollably. Henry tried giving the child a pacifier, but when that didn't work, he did something truly monstrous. He grabbed a towel and began strangling the baby. Eventually the crying stopped. Before leaving, Henry wiped down the entire apartment, making sure to erase any fingerprints. He then stole Bry's TV and stereo system and disappeared into the night, leaving behind another horrifying crime scene. Next, Henry pawned off both stolen items and used the money to buy more crack. Fortunately, Bry's baby survived the attack, but by this time the police were finally closing in on Henry after the discovery of two murdered women in the same apartment complex. Local authorities held a meeting. They compared the recent murders and quickly realized a chilling pattern. Each victim was somehow connected to one man, Henry Louis Wallace. In hindsight, these connections should have been made much sooner, but due to a lack of resources and urgency, law enforcement had failed to act. While police were piecing things together and preparing to arrest him, Henry was already hunting for his next victim. This time he targeted Deborah Slaughter, a former co-worker of his girlfriend at Bojangles. Henry knew that Deborah used crack, and he planned to exploit this. When he arrived at her home, he tried to convince her to split the cost of drugs with him, but she refused. Frustrated, Henry asked for a drink. As soon as turned her back, he grabbed a towel and wrapped it around her neck. As she struggled, she did something shocking. She accused him of murdering Brandy Henderson and Betty Beckham, and instead of denying it, Henry responded by assaulting her. Then he started rummaging through her purse looking for valuables. Knowing that Deborah kept the knife in her bag, Henry forced her to dump out the contents in front of him. As soon as the knife fell to the ground, he kicked it away and demanded all the money in her wallet. She handed over $40, but Deborah wasn't going down without a fight. In a moment of defiance, she smacked Henry across the face and started screaming for help, but Henry wasn't about to let her escape. He tightened the towel around her neck, once again forcing her to the ground before repeatedly stabbing her 38 times in the stomach and chest. Within moments, Deborah succumbed to her injuries. After robbing her, Henry used the stolen money to buy more crack, but later that night he made a chilling move. He returned to her apartment to clean up the scene just as he had done before. However, his reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The very next day, police arrested Henry Louis Wallace. Wallace denied everything. At first he tried to distance himself from the crimes, but the weight of the investigation was undeniable. Police had fingerprints linking him to a stolen vehicle, ATM footage of him using Vanessa's debit card, and eyewitness accounts placing him at the crime scenes. Under pressure, Wallace cracked when asked to write down the names of his victims. Detectives expected 4 names for murders they had already connected to him, but as Wallace kept writing, their stomachs churned. The list was longer than they had feared. He was responsible for at least 11 murders, a horrifying revelation that transformed their investigation into one of the most chilling serial killer cases in North Carolina's history. To understand Henry Louis Wallace, we have to go back to where it all started. Born in Barnwell, South Carolina in 1965, Henry grew up in a small town with his mother and sister. His father left before he was born and his mother was strict, controlling and often cruel. She made sure Henry followed her every rule, but despite her efforts Wallace wasn't a good student. He struggled in school, rarely stood out, and never showed signs of brilliance or violence. After high school he bounced from job to job, served in the Navy, and eventually moved to Charlotte, North Carolina in the early 1990s, where his killing spree would begin. Now Henry's dark obsession with violence against women didn't start when he became a killer. It started much earlier, when he was just a boy. One day young Henry witnessed a horrifying attack in the woods. A group of men assaulted a woman, and instead of feeling shock or fear, Henry later confessed that the scene excited him. That disturbing moment planted a seed in his mind, a twisted fascination that would later fuel his killing spree. In his confession, Wallace revealed that Caroline Love wasn't his first victim. In fact, his violent actions had started 2 years before her tragic death. His known victim was someone he had known for years, Shondonda Bathia, a high school student who had trusted him. Wallace had been quietly fixating on her, but no one around them had noticed the warning signs. One evening he offered her a ride. She had no reason to feel unsafe. After all, she'd known him for a long time, but once inside the car the situation changed. Wallace attacked her, took her life, and left her body in a pond, hoping no one would ever find out. For weeks her loved one searched for her, holding on to hope that she would return home, but that hope was shattered when her body was discovered in the water. Wallace was questioned by the police, but there wasn't enough evidence to connect him to the crime, and so he walked free. After realizing how easy it was to get away with his crimes, Wallace continued his violent spree, but before he even took the life of Caroline Love, he had already claimed another victim. In May of 1992 he crossed paths with Sharon Nance, a 33-year-old woman who had lived a difficult life. She worked hard to survive, but that night all she wanted was what she was owed. Wallace refused to pay, and when she stood up for herself he reacted with brutal violence. He beat her mercilessly before leaving her lifeless body near the railroad tracks. Days later she was found, but by then Wallace was already moving on. For the next 2 years he continued choosing victims, women he knew personally, women who trusted him, and all the while no one realized a serial killer was living among them too. Years after his arrest, Henry Louis Wallace finally faced trial in September of 1996. His defense team attempted to argue that Wallace suffered from mental illness and drug addiction, claiming that his use of crack cocaine impaired his judgment. While there was no denying that he had taken the lives of multiple women, his lawyers insisted that his crimes did not amount to first-degree murder. They claimed they were not premeditated acts, but rather impulsive violence driven by addiction. However, Wallace's own words betrayed him. His recorded confession revealed that in at least some of these cases he had planned the murders ahead of time. He admitted to entering the homes of his victims with the intent to rob and kill them, contradicting the defense's argument. The trial lasted for 3 months, and on January 7, 1997 the jury reached a verdict. Henry Louis Wallace was convicted of the first-degree murder of 9 women. The sentence was clear: 9 death sentences, 1 for each life he had taken. On June 5, 1998 Henry Louis Wallace shocked the public once again, not with another crime but with a wedding inside North Carolina's death row, just steps away from the state's execution chamber. Wallace married Rebecca Tiges, a former prison nurse. The Mecklenburg County Public Defender Isabel Day acted as an official witness and even took photos of the ceremony. Also present was the manager of the convicted serial killer. Exchanged vows, but Wallace wasn't focused only on his new marriage. He was also determined to escape his fate. Since being sentenced to death in 1997, he has made several appeals arguing that his confessions were coerced and that his constitutional rights were violated. Despite his efforts, the North Carolina Supreme Court upheld his sentence in the year 2000. Then in 2001 the United States Supreme Court denied his appeal, leaving him with little hope of overturning his punishment. By 2005, after another rejected appeal, it became clear that Wallace was running out of options. Today Henry Louis Wallace remains on death row, awaiting execution. However, for the families of his victims, justice remains an elusive concept. While the legal system handed down its harshest sentence. Nothing can ever undo the pain and loss that Wallace inflicted. The scars left behind by his crimes will never fully heal, no matter the punishment he receives. Story 4. When it comes to those kind of things, time doesn't matter because it's your loved ones and you know to kill the lives of innocent people just like that. Studies. If your brother-in-law showed no emotion and refused to cooperate with the police after his entire family was murdered, how would you feel? Suspicious, angry, heartbroken. 4. Alan Lever, the man you see in that video. The pain was unbearable. 27 years ago he discovered that his mother's sister and 2 nieces had been slaughtered in their own home in Miramar, Florida. A crime so brutal, so savage, it still haunts investigators to this day, yet the one person who should have been demanding justice remains silent. This is the story of the Altador family, a tragedy so haunting that by the time you finish this video you'll be left questioning everything. On the morning of April 30th, 1997, the Alator family began their day just like any other. 29-year-old Marie Alator was at home caring for her 2 baby girls, Samantha, just 2 years old, and tiny little Sabrina, barely 6 weeks old. Alongside them was Marie's mother, 68-year-old Teresa Levern, who was there to lend a helping hand. Their home in Miramar, Florida was filled with the sounds of giggles, baby cries, and the comforting presence of family. Like every morning, Marie's husband George left for work at exactly 7:00. It was part of their usual routine, but as the day went on and afternoon rolled around, George did what any husband and father would do. He called home to check in with a new baby in the house. He probably wanted to know how Marie was holding up, if the baby was sleeping okay, or if she needed anything, but something didn't feel right. The first call went unanswered, then the second and the third. This wasn't like them. With 2 adults at home, someone should have picked up even if they had stepped out for a but the silence on the other end only made George's worry grow. With this being said, he reached out to his brother-in-law and asked him to stop by the house. Maybe the phone was just misplaced or they had gone outside for a bit, but when his brother-in-law arrived at the house he was met with something that would shock him for decades to come: the bodies of Marie Alator, her mother Teresa, and her 2 baby girls Samantha and Sabrina were found under circumstances so horrifying that even today those who witnessed the scene are haunted by the memories. The home that had once been filled with warmth, laughter, and the innocent giggles of children had been turned into something unrecognizable, a place of pure horror. But the big question is, who could have done this? The Altador family had no known enemies. In fact, they were widely known as a kind, loving, and peaceful family. They weren't involved in any conflicts, nor did they have any ties to crime, so why were they targeted in such a brutal and merciless way? To even begin to understand, we need to step back and truly get to know Marie Alator, the woman at the heart of this family. By all accounts, Marie Carmel Alator was a woman of quiet strength, resilience, and grace. She was originally from Haiti, where she grew up with big dreams of a better life. Like so many immigrants, she faced many struggles adjusting to a new country, but she never let obstacles break her spirit. Determined to create a brighter future, she eventually settled in the warm, welcoming embrace of South Florida. Now, Marie's faith was also an important part of her life. After settling in Florida, she began attending the Haitian Evangelical Baptist Church in Miami. It was there that she met the man who would become her husband, George Alator. Originally from Haiti, George was also known for taking both his religion and education seriously. Like many others chasing a better future, he eventually moved to South Florida, where he became an active member of the same church Maria attended. But they weren't the first to fall in love. In fact, George had been married once before and even had a son with his ex-wife. However, their marriage ended in divorce in September of 1991. Not long after George and Marie's paths crossed and a romance blossomed. By February of 1994 they were married, and later that same year they welcomed their first child together, a beautiful baby girl named Samantha. In the summer of 1995, the Alator family moved to Miramar, Florida, purchasing a 4-bedroom home with a pool in a peaceful neighborhood. They were settling into a comfortable and fulfilling life. Maria had started working as a secretary for the Dade County School Board's information office, where she also helped produce a morning radio program in Creole. George, on the other hand, worked as a plant manager for Aqua Air Products. a marine air conditioning company in Halia, a job he had dedicated over a decade to. On top of that, he had also earned his real estate license and began working part-time as a real estate agent. Those who knew the Elators described them as a quiet church-going family deeply involved with their congregation. Sundays were always reserved for church services, often followed by gatherings with fellow parishioners and family members. Their faith was the foundation of their lives, giving them strength, purpose, and a strong sense of community. By early 1997, their family was growing. Once again, Marie was pregnant with their second child, and in March they welcomed their youngest daughter Sabrina with a newborn and a toddler at home. Marie's mother, Teresa Leverne, who still lived in Haiti, made plans to fly to Florida. She wanted to support her daughter during this precious but exhausting time and also be there for her granddaughter's christening scheduled for the first week of May. Any mother knows that having an extra pair of hands during those exhausting first weeks with a newborn is invaluable, especially when there's also a toddler to care for. Marie was surely grateful for her mother's presence, helping to balance the joys and challenges of motherhood. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. On the morning of April 30th, 1997, everything seemed normal in the Altador household. Teresa had already arrived from Haiti and the family was settling into a routine. According to George, he left for work at exactly 7 in the morning, just as he always did. Inside their home, Marie, Teresa, and the two little girls were still there, likely starting their day like any other. According to family and friends, George had a habit of calling home during the day to check on Marie and the kids while he was at work. That day was no different. He first called the house around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, but no one answered. Thinking little of it, he tried again an hour later at 3 o'clock, but once more there was no response. This was unusual. Marie was still on maternity leave, meaning she was typically home at that time. If she had stepped out for a moment, her mother, Teresa, should have been there to answer the phone, but the continued silence on the other end of the line was unsettling. This got him so worried that he decided to reach out to his brother-in-law, asking him to go over and check on Marie, Teresa, and the children. His brother-in-law agreed, quickly grabbing his son and heading to the Altador house to see what was going on. They got to the house around 5:00 in the afternoon. For a while they kept knocking and calling out, but no one answered. That's when his brother-in-law decided to try the door. To his surprise, it wasn't even locked. Remember, his son was with him at the time. As they both stepped inside, the first thing they noticed was the bassinet sitting right in front of the TV. At first it didn't seem out of place, but as they got closer, their stomachs dropped. Inside, baby Sabrina lay completely still, her tiny body covered in blood. That alone was horrifying, but what he saw next shattered him even more. Just a few feet away in the kitchen, his mother Teresa was lying in a pool of her own blood. The brother-in-law was so shocked, so overwhelmed, that he immediately grabbed his son and ran out the house yelling for help. He called out to the neighbors, desperate for someone to confirm if his mother and niece were still alive. One of the neighbors quickly dialed 911, and that call came in at exactly 5:42 p.m. reporting what they had just found. When police arrived just minutes later, they had no idea what they were about to walk into, because the scene on the other side of that door would haunt even the most seasoned investigators for years to come. Just as George's brother-in-law had described, 6-week-old Sabrina was still in her bassinet in the living room, but the sight was horrifying. Her tiny body showed clear signs of a brutal beating. Officers believed she had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object. A few steps away in the kitchen lay Teresa, her body sprawled on the floor. She had been shot in the head, and like the baby had also been beaten to death. But the horror didn't end there. As officers moved through the house, they found 2 more bodies, one in the corner of the living room and another in the dining room. It was there that Marie was found face down in a pool of blood, and her injuries are even more gruesome. She had been shot multiple times in the chest, stabbed, and then bludgeoned in the head. The level of violence was beyond anything the officers had expected. The last victim was 2-year-old Samantha. She had been found in the living room, wedged between the couch and a chair. Unlike the others, her position suggested that she had been trying to hide, but it hadn't saved her. She too had been beaten to death. The sheer brutality of the crime forced investigators to dig deeper, and as they combed through the house they were left baffled. It quickly became clear that robbery was not the motive. The furniture was undisturbed, electronics untouched, and valuable jewelry remained exactly where it was left. Strangely, no murder weapon was found at the scene. Then came an even more unsettling discovery: there were no signs of forced entry. The doors were unlocked, nothing was broken, and there was no evidence of a struggle near the entrance. This pointed to a chilling possibility that the killer was someone the family knew, someone who didn't need to force their way inside, someone they trusted enough to let in outside in. The gated yard officers found the family dog, but according to reports the dog was friendly, not the type to bark or attack even at strangers. This raised an even more disturbing question: was the killer a complete outsider who simply went unnoticed, or was it someone much closer, someone who belonged there? As the detectives continued searching the home, they stumbled upon a chilling clue. In one of the rooms, a message scrolled on the wall in messy handwriting: "I want my $100. 000 drug money. They stole my drugs." At first glance it seemed to point to a drug deal gone wrong, a violent retaliation, but there was one glaring problem. After a thorough search of the home, investigators found no trace of drugs, no hidden stashes, no paraphernalia. Nothing even more puzzling, neither Marie nor George had any known connections to drugs or illegal dealings. This led to a series of unanswered questions that didn't add up. If this was really a drug deal gone wrong, why was the jewelry left untouched? Why didn't the killer even try to check George's office, where the supposed drug money could have been hidden? If they were desperate to get their money back, wouldn't they have searched every inch of the house? And the most disturbing question of all: why would a thief or a drug dealer take the time to brutally beat a 6-week-old baby to death? There was no logic to it. By now it was clear to detectives that this wasn't about money, this was rage. The chilling message scrolled on the wall demanding drug money was nothing more than a smoke screen, a desperate attempt to mislead the investigation. With no signs of forced entry and no clear motive that pointed to an outsider, detectives had to consider a disturbing possibility: the killer wasn't a stranger at all, and the most obvious suspect George. Later, in countless cases like this, when an entire family is slaughtered so brutally, the perpetrator is usually someone within the household, someone with a personal vendetta. When news of the murders first broke, George was caught on camera, devastated, trying to push past officers to get inside the house. He looked frantic, broken, desperate to see his family. At first glance it seemed like the reaction of a grieving husband and father, but then when it was time for questioning, his behavior took a drastic shift. Instead of being overwhelmed with sorrow or demanding justice for his wife and children, George was eerily calm. He didn't ask about the investigation, he didn't plead for the killer to be found. Instead he simply said, "It's in God's hands now, God will prevail, Jesus knows." To detectives this response was unsettling. Yes, George was known to be deeply religious, but his lack of urgency, his almost passive acceptance of the tragedy didn't sit right with them. Most grieving husbands and fathers would be overcome with emotion, demanding answers, desperate for justice, but George, he was unfazed. He failed to provide any real answers, barely engaged in the questioning, and then, just as calmly as he had walked in, he got up and left. Although George consistently denied any involvement in the murders, detectives found it increasingly difficult to eliminate him as a suspect. His behavior, coupled with the lack of any other viable suspects, only deepened their suspicions. At one point in the investigation, George agreed to take a polygraph test, but the results indicated deception in his responses. While this was concerning, polygraph tests are not considered reliable evidence in court, and without any concrete proof to support the findings, detectives couldn't arrest him based on the test alone. Not long after George stopped cooperating with the investigation entirely, he refused to speak with detectives and withdrew from public life, only strengthening their belief that he knew more than he was letting on. In the wake of the murders, George moved in with his sister and brother-in-law, avoiding the public eye. Suspicion followed him everywhere, and soon he stopped attending church and took a leave of absence from work. Those close to him said he knew people would start asking questions he seemingly didn't want to answer. Meanwhile, detectives continued to pore over the evidence, chasing every possible lead. They ruled out robbery, they ruled out drugs, but no matter how much they investigated they couldn't rule out George. A handwriting analysis was conducted to compare George's writing to the chilling message left on the wall, but the results were not a match even so. Detectives couldn't shake the feeling that George was hiding something. One would think that if your entire family was brutally murdered, you would stop at nothing to help the police hunt down the person responsible, but not George. From the very beginning, detectives noticed something off about his behavior. While most grieving husbands and fathers would be desperate for answers, George was described as aggressively uncooperative during the investigation. He didn't ask questions, he didn't demand updates, and after just a second interview with police he stopped speaking to them altogether. But then detectives discovered something that shook the case even further. On the morning of the murders at exactly 7:09 a.m. a call was placed from the family's home to Marie's uncle, who was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. He didn't answer, but his wife did. However, she wasn't sure who exactly she spoke to. Although she initially believed it was Marie, she wasn't familiar with her voice, and when Marie's family learned about the call they began to suspect that it wasn't actually her, and here's why. That phone call made no sense. The timing of the call was critical. It was made exactly 9 minutes after George was said to have left for work, where he arrived at 7:30 a.m. Now, if Marie was still alive at that time, then George physically could not have been the killer. There simply wouldn't have been enough time for him to commit 4 brutal murders and make it to work on time. But if Marie wasn't the one on that call, then who was? And could it mean that there was another suspect? Despite this eerie and unexplained phone call, detectives found themselves hitting a dead end. They followed every lead, they knocked on doors, questioned neighbors, retraced George's movements, and dug deep into his past. But after weeks turned into months and months into years, the case stalled. A $155,000 reward was even offered in hopes that anyone would come forward with new information. But as time went on and no fresh leads surfaced, the reward was withdrawn and the case went completely cold. Still, Marie's family refused to give up. They held vigils and memorials to keep the story alive. They reached out to true crime shows, hoping the national spotlight might uncover new evidence, and throughout it all they remained firm in their belief that George knew more than he was saying. The family's not giving up, the police department has not given up, and we're still out here as if though it was 25 years ago. Police say their only suspect was Marie's husband George later, but say they never had enough evidence to make an arrest. I'm just telling them today, get ready, you will be found. Family members say not only are they hopeful that the killer will be found, they're sure police have done everything they can, but we believe in God is good and almighty and all-powerful, and there is nothing that God will not solve. And we do have a conviction. As the years passed, George moved on. A few years after his wife and children were killed, he remarried and relocated to Oklahoma. Now his decision to remarry shocked Marie's family, but when they learned who he married, their grief turned to anger. The night before the murders, George had reportedly been at the home of a female friend, someone familiar to both him and Marie. He claimed he was there to fix an air conditioning unit, but rumors swirled that he had been having an affair with this woman. Though he was the only suspect in the case, he has never been charged in connection with the brutal murders of his wife, daughters, and mother-in-law. It's almost unthinkable that someone could slaughter 4 innocent people, including a 6-week-old baby, and still walk among society. The crime scene was so gruesome that many officers and detectives involved in the case required counseling to cope with what they had seen. The pain endured by the victim's family never faded, and the weight of their loss remains as heavy as ever. Justice may be slow, but it should never be silent. Cases like this remind us that there are still families waiting for answers, still victims whose voices need to be heard, and for us it's an incredible honor to share the story of the Alater family, hoping that someone out there knows something that could finally bring justice to this case. Story 5. The most important thing, like I'm not sure, or I'll just wait for you to ask questions, but like it's I want them wherever they're at, like I have no inclination of where they're at right now, like I've exhausted like every friend that I know of, and every friend that I have is called friends that Sean and has that maybe I didn't know about, and it's just like it's like it's vanished, like she's not. Like when I got home yesterday, it was like a ghost town, like she wasn't here, kids weren't here, I have no idea Like where they went and it's just earth-shattering. I don't feel like this is even real right now. It's like a nightmare that I just can't wake up from. In this video, a father pleads for his missing family's return. His name is Chris Watts, and within days America would discover that the man making this emotional plea was hiding something unthinkable. No one could have predicted that this seemingly perfect family would become the center of countless true crime documentaries, YouTube deep dives and headlines across the globe. This photo was shared just days before Shaun Watts and her two little girls disappeared. What makes it truly chilling is the heartbreaking reality that soon after it was taken, their lives would be tragically cut short by the very person who was meant to protect them, their father. This isn't just another tragic crime story. This case sent shockwaves through America, forcing millions to question how a devoted husband and father could transform into a cold-blooded killer overnight. But as we peel back the layers, you'll see that beneath the surface things were never as perfect as they seemed. So who was Chris Watts before the world knew his name, and what could possibly drive him to destroy the very people who trusted him the most? Well, before we dive into the darkness that would eventually consume this family, let's start by getting to know them. First, the story of Chris and Shaun Watts began like many modern love stories. Shaun Rusk, born on January 30, 1984 in New Jersey, had already weathered her share of storms by the time she met Chris. Growing up in North Carolina, she had battled lupus since her teenage years, but she never let it define her. Instead, she channeled her energy into building a successful career in sales and eventually became a rising star in the health and wellness industry. Chris Watts' early life was notably different. Born on May 16, 1985. In Oklahoma, he grew up in North Carolina in what appeared to be a perfectly normal household, quiet and reserved. Chris was the kind of person who preferred to blend into the background. He worked as an automotive mechanic before transitioning to the oil industry, where his technical skills and attention to detail served him well. Their paths crossed in 2010 when they connected on Facebook. For Shaun, who had recently divorced and was ready for a fresh start, Chris seemed like everything she had been looking for. He was stable, hardworking, and appeared utterly devoted to her. Within months of meeting in person, their relationship blossomed into something serious. The couple married on November 3, 2012 in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Soon after, they moved to Colorado for better opportunities, settling into a beautiful 5-bedroom home in Frederick, a quiet suburb north of Denver. Chris secured a good job as an operator for Anadarko Petroleum, while Shaun threw herself into building her business as a promoter for a health and wellness company called Thrive. Their family grew quickly. In 2013, they welcomed their first daughter, Bella Marie. Just 15 months later, in July 2015, Celeste Catherine, whom they lovingly called Cease, joined the family. From the outside, they appeared to be living the American dream. As you can see, their social media posts painted a picture of a happy, successful family, vacations, celebrations, and countless moments of joy captured and shared with the world. Shaun, in particular, was prolific on social media, regularly posting updates about their life, her business ventures, and her daughter's milestones. She would often praise Chris, calling him the best dad in the world, and her rock. Her posts showed a family that seemed to have it all: beautiful children, a loving marriage, financial success, and a bright future ahead. By the summer of 2018, things appeared to be getting even better. Shaun was 15 weeks pregnant with their third child, a boy they planned to name Nico. She had just returned from a successful business trip to Arizona, and the family had recently enjoyed a 6-week visit with Chris's parents in North Carolina. But beneath this perfectly curated surface, something sinister was brewing, and on August 13, 2018, everything would change forever. In the early morning hours of that summer day, Shaun returned home from a business trip, exhausted but happy to be back with her family. She was dropped off at her house at 1:48 a.m. by her friend and colleague Nicole Atkinson. Little did Nicole know that this would be the last time she would see her friend alive. What happened in the hours that followed would expose the dark truth behind a picture-perfect facade and reveal how one man's secrets and lies would lead to an unthinkable tragedy that would capture the nation's attention and leave everyone asking, how could someone do This to their own family. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. The morning of August 13th started like any other in the quiet suburb of Frederick, Colorado, but by 9:00 a.m. alarm bells were already ringing for Nicole Atkinson. She had tried calling and texting Shannon multiple times, but there was no response, something completely out of character for her friend, who was usually quick to reply. Shannon had a doctor's appointment scheduled for that morning to check on her pregnancy, but when Nicole called the doctor's office, they confirmed what she feared: Shannon hadn't shown up. What made this even more concerning was that Shannon had been experiencing one of the most challenging periods of her life. Just weeks earlier, she had confided in friends about growing tensions in her marriage. During their recent 6-week trip to North Carolina, Chris had been acting distant, refusing to touch or kiss her. When she tried to plan a romantic weekend to work on their relationship, he seemed cold and uninterested. The signs had been there, subtle at first but growing more obvious as summer progressed. Chris, who had always been attentive and loving, began changing his appearance, working out obsessively and buying new clothes. He started going out more, claiming he was meeting work friends, and became protective of his phone. But perhaps most telling was his reaction when Sean revealed she was pregnant with their third child. Instead of joy, his response was oddly muted, almost cold. Shannon had poured her heart out in text messages to her friends, sharing her fears and confusion about Chris's behavior. He hasn't touched me all week, kissed me, talked to me, except for when I'm trying to figure out what is wrong, she wrote to one friend. We've never had a problem in our relationship like this, no joke, never. This is total left field. That's why when Nicole couldn't reach Sean in that morning, she knew something was terribly wrong. She drove to the Watts home, bringing her son Nicholas with her. When they arrived, they found Shannon's car still parked in the garage. Her shoes, which she always left by the door, were exactly where they should be. Her phone, which was practically an extension of her hand given her work in social media marketing, was nowhere to be found. Nicole tried ringing the doorbell and knocking, but the house remained silent. She called Chris, who seemed surprisingly unconcerned, saying Shannon was probably just busy with the girls, but Nicole knew better. She could see Shannon's essential medication still in her car, medication she never went anywhere without. The security system was also armed, meaning no one had left through the front door since Shannon's return. Growing increasingly worried, Nicole called the Frederick Police Department. Officer Scott Conrad arrived at the house around 1:45 p.m. Chris, who had been contacted at work, arrived home shortly after. What happened next would be captured by the officer's body camera, preserving a chilling moment that would later be scrutinized by millions. As you can see, Chris arrived and entered the garage door code. He appeared calm, too calm for someone whose pregnant wife and young daughters were missing. He led the officer through the house, which showed no signs of struggle or forced entry. Everything was in its place. The girls' beds were made, their toys were organized, and there was no indication of anyone leaving in a hurry. But there were subtle details that spoke volumes. Shannon's wedding ring was sitting on the bedside table, something she never took off. Her purse and keys were still in the house, and most disturbing of all, her phone was found between the couch cushions, powered off, something completely out of character for the social media savvy businesswoman. As Officer Conrad questioned Chris about his family's whereabouts, his responses were vague and oddly detached. He suggested that maybe Shannon had taken the girls to a friend's house, but couldn't explain why she would leave without her car, phone, or medication. When asked about any problems in their marriage, Chris downplayed the tensions that Shannon had confided to her friends about just days earlier. That evening, as news of the disappearance spread, friends and neighbors gathered at the Watts home. Among them was Nathan Tranastic, whose security camera had a clear view of the Watts driveway. What that camera captured in the early morning hours would later become crucial evidence. Around 5:15 a.m. it recorded Chris backing his work truck up to the garage, something he had never done before, and loading something into the back. As the community rallied to help find the missing mother and daughters, Chris's behavior continued to raise eyebrows. While others were frantically organizing search parties and putting up missing person posters, he remained eerily calm. The next day, on August 14th, he agreed to do a series of TV Interviews that would come back to haunt him. Standing on his front porch, Chris looked into the cameras and made a plea that sent chills down viewers' spines. I want everybody back here and everybody safe. Take a look. And you can clearly see something was off about his demeanor while he spoke about his missing family. His body language told a different story. He crossed his arms defensively, showed no genuine emotion, and at times even smiled inappropriately. Behavioral experts would later point out how he spoke about his family in the past tense, a common tell among those who know their loved ones are no longer alive. Meanwhile, investigators were piecing together troubling evidence. They discovered that despite the family's picture-perfect social media presence, the Watts were drowning in debt. They had previously filed for bankruptcy in 2015 and new financial strains were mounting. There was also the matter of Chris' recent behavior changes, not just his physical transformation but his sudden interest in tracking his macronutrients and his newfound need for privacy with his phone. But the most damning discovery was yet to come. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered something that would blow the case wide open. Chris Watts was having an affair with a Sea Orker named Nickel Kessinger. The relationship had begun in June, just 2 months before the disappearance, and had quickly intensified while Shannon was away in North Carolina with the girls. Chris and Nickel's relationship had become serious. He told her he was in the process of separating from his wife, never mentioning that Shannon was pregnant with their third child. Text messages revealed that in the days leading up to the disappearance, Chris had been making plans for a future with Nickel. He was looking at apartment listings and researching jewelry. All this while Shannon was desperately trying to save their marriage, even buying relationship self-help books and planning a romantic weekend away. The investigation took a dramatic turn when police brought Chris in for questioning on August 15. For hours he maintained his story that Shannon had simply taken the girls and left, but as investigators pressed him with mounting evidence, including the security camera footage and cell phone data that contradicted his timeline, his story began to crumble. Then, in a twist that stunned investigators, Chris asked to speak with his father, Ronnie Watts, who had flown in from North Carolina. What happened next would be captured on the interrogation room camera, preserving one of the most chilling confessions in recent criminal history. After speaking with his father, Chris emerged with a new story, one that was both a confession and a desperate attempt to shift blame. He claimed that when he woke up that morning, he and Shannon had an emotional conversation about their relationship. According to him, when he told her about his affair, she became distraught. He then made the unconscionable claim that Shannon had harmed their daughters and that he, in a fit of rage, had taken her life. But investigators weren't buying it. The evidence simply didn't match his story. Cell phone records, surveillance footage, and other evidence painted a very different picture of what happened in those early morning hours of August 13. As pressure mounted, Chris finally agreed to lead investigators to his family in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. He revealed the devastating truth about where they could find Shannon and the girls. The location he directed them to was the Anadarko oil field, where he worked, about 45 minutes from their home there at the oil site known as Survey 319. Investigators made a heartbreaking discovery. Shannon had been laid to rest in a shallow grave. In an even more tragic turn, the girls had been placed in separate oil tanks. Chris had used his knowledge as an oil field operator to hide his horrible crimes, choosing locations he knew would be difficult to access. The details that emerged about that morning were devastating. Chris had waited for Shannon to return from her business trip, knowing exactly what he planned to do after she came home and went to bed. He put his sinister plan into motion. The medical examiner would later confirm that Shannon and her unborn son, whom they had planned to name Nico, had lost their lives in their own bedroom. What made this crime even more horrific was that Bella and Celeste had been alive during the 45-minute drive to the oil field. Bella, who was just 4 years old, had even pleaded with her father, asking him to spare her life, but Chris, in an act of unimaginable cruelty, had proceeded with his plan, ultimately taking the lives of both his daughters. The investigation revealed that Chris had been planning this for some time. In the days leading up to the murders, he had been texting his girlfriend about their future together. As news of the discovery spread, the community that had been hoping and praying for the safe Return of the Watts family was devastated. Thousands gathered for candlelight vigils, leaving teddy bears, flowers and heartfelt messages outside the Watts home. The case that had captured national attention had come to the worst possible conclusion on November 6, 2018. Chris Watts appeared in court for his arraignment. The courtroom was packed with family members, media and members of the community who had been following the case. In a move that surprised many, Chris decided to accept a plea deal by pleading guilty to 9 charges, including first-degree murder. Chris would avoid the death penalty. The charges included 3 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of first-degree murder of a child under the age of 12, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The sentencing hearing on November 19 was emotionally charged. Shannon's father, Frank Rzusk, delivered a powerful victim impact statement that brought many in the courtroom to tears. Life will never be the same without Sean and Bella, Celeste and Nico. They had all their lives to live. They were taken by a heartless one, taken by an evil monster. The most gut-wrenching moment came when Shannon's mother, Sandra Rzusk, addressed the court through tears. She spoke directly to Chris. Even Chris's own parents struggled to comprehend what their son had done. His mother, Cindy Watts, spoke to the media outside the courthouse. Judge Marcelo Kopkow didn't hold back when delivering the sentence. He described the case as the most inhumane and vicious crime I have handled out of the thousands of cases that I have seen. He then handed down the maximum sentence possible, 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole for the murders, plus additional years for the other charges. But the story didn't end with the sentencing. In February 2019, Chris agreed to a 5-hour prison interview with investigators where he finally revealed the full truth about what happened that morning. His new confession contradicted his earlier claim about Sean and harming the children. He admitted that he had planned the murders, wanting to start a new life with his girlfriend. The details he provided about his daughter's final moments were heartbreaking. 4-year-old Bella had walked into the bedroom after he had taken Shannon's life, asking, "What's wrong with mommy?" He then loaded his wife's body and his living daughters into his work truck, driving them to the oil field where he would commit his final horrific acts. The revelation of these details devastated both families all over again. Shannon's brother, Frankie Rzusk, took to social media to express his anguish. "I've never been so angry, sad and confused in my life. My sister and nieces were the light of the world. The pain never goes away." The case had a profound impact on the community of Frederick, Colorado. The Watts house, once a symbol of suburban success, became a haunting reminder of the tragedy. Neighbors reported that people would drive by at all hours, some leaving flowers and stuffed animals, others simply trying to make sense of how such horror could unfold in their quiet community. The Watts family case sparked intense public interest, partly because of how it challenged our perceptions of domestic violence and family dynamics. Here was a family that appeared perfect on social media: regular vacation photos, loving messages and constant updates about their seemingly idyllic life. The contrast between these carefully curated posts and the dark reality beneath the surface led to important discussions about how social media can mask serious problems within families. Nicole Kessinger, Chris's girlfriend, also became entangled in the aftermath of the case. Although investigators cleared her of any involvement in the crimes, she was forced to change her identity and relocate due to intense public scrutiny and harassment. In her only interview with police, she expressed horror at Chris's actions and insisted she had no idea he was still married, let alone that Shannon was pregnant. The case has since become the subject of numerous documentaries, books and television specials. Netflix's documentary American Murder: The Family Next Door brought renewed attention to the case in 2020, using Shannon's own social media videos and text messages to tell the story. The documentary highlighted how Shannon's extensive social media presence left behind a digital footprint that would help investigators piece together the family's final days. Perhaps most disturbing was how Chris's behavior in the days following the murders revealed signs that experts now say could help identify similar cases: his inappropriate emotional responses during interviews, his quick attempt to sell the family home, and his inconsistent stories, all pointed to his guilt. These warning signs have since become teaching tools for law enforcement and domestic violence prevention groups. The case also led to changes in how law enforcement handles missing persons cases involving young children. The swift action of Nicole Atkinson in alerting police and the quick response of the Frederick Police Department have been praised as examples of best practices in such situations. The fact that evidence was preserved due to rapid police involvement has become a model for other departments. Chris Watts now serves his multiple life sentences at Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin. He was transferred there from Colorado for security reasons. According to prison sources, he keeps photos of his family in his cell and claims to read the Bible daily, saying he's found religion behind bars. He receives regular letters from women who write to him in prison, a phenomenon that psychologists say is not uncommon with high-profile killers. Meanwhile, Shannon's family has worked to keep her memory alive while advocating for domestic violence awareness. They established a foundation in honor of Shannon, Bella, Celeste and Nico, which works to help women and children escaping dangerous domestic situations. Frank and Sandra Zusk have become vocal advocates for victims' rights and have spoken at numerous domestic violence awareness events every year. On August 13, the community of Frederick, Colorado holds a remembrance ceremony for Shannon, Bella, Celeste and baby Nico. The memorial garden created in their honor serves as both a tribute to their lives and a reminder of the importance of recognizing and addressing domestic violence before it escalates to tragedy. In a poignant gesture, Shannon's mother now manages her daughter's social media accounts, transforming them from a chronicle of family life into a memorial that raises awareness about domestic violence. The same platforms that once showcased the family's seemingly perfect life now serve as a warning about the dangers that can lurk behind carefully curated images. Letters and messages continue to pour in from people around the world who have been touched by this case. Many share their own stories of recognizing warning signs in their relationships after learning about the Watts family tragedy. Others express how the case has made them more aware of the importance of checking on friends and family members who might be struggling. The Rusk family has channeled their grief into action, working with legislators to strengthen laws protecting pregnant women and children from domestic violence. Their advocacy has led to discussions about new legislation that would increase penalties for crimes against pregnant women and provide more resources for domestic violence prevention. Frank Rozek, Shannon's father, perhaps said it best in a recent interview: "We lost so much in a single morning, a daughter, grandchildren, and a future we'll never get to see. But if sharing our story helps even one person recognize the warning signs and get help, then Sean and Bella, Celeste and Nico didn't die in vain." As we conclude this tragic story, it's worth remembering that behind the headlines, social media posts and sensational coverage were real people: a mother who loved her children fiercely, two little girls who had their whole lives ahead of them, and an unborn baby boy who never got the chance to take his first breath. Their story serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence doesn't always show itself in obvious ways. Sometimes it hides behind smiling family photos and perfectly worded social media posts. It reminds us to look deeper, to check on our loved ones, and to take action when something doesn't feel right. Chris Watts will spend the rest of his life in prison, but the impact of his crimes continues to ripple through society every time someone recognizes a warning sign. Because of this case, every time a friend decides to make that welfare check, every time someone finds the courage to leave a dangerous situation. That's part of the legacy of Shannon, Bella, Celeste and Nico Watts. Their story, as heartbreaking as it is, has become a catalyst for change, a wake-up call about the realities of domestic violence, and a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters aren't strangers, they're the ones closest to home. Story 6, Waller County 911. Yes ma'am, my name is Rodney Dykes. I need an ambulance and police at SoCal Boulevard, please. Okay, what's going on? I don't know everything, but my son's wife is dead, please. Okay, Angie Diaz was a beautiful young woman, a sweet wife and a loving daughter, but from what you just heard on that phone call, she would soon be found dead with her head savagely separated from her body. You can't even keep it straight for anybody. The man who just laughed while her murder is being Interrogated, is her own husband the one who promised the world to her but then snatched her whole life away? I got as far as the doorway, I didn't go in. This is a murder scene, decapitation. This is an ugly spot. Before this horrific scene just 3 months earlier, Angie and Jared had stood side by side grinning in their wedding photos, full of hope and plans for the future, a new marriage, a fresh start. Everything would seem right a few months down the line, but what happened between I do and I killed? How could Jared do this to his beloved wife? And more importantly, why did this even happen before January 11, 2023? Everything seemed normal, at least from the outside. Angie Diaz was described by those who knew her as endlessly kind, always smiling and full of warmth. Her co-workers adored her. Her absence was now already devastating. Tears would roll down her loved ones' eyes when they told the media how dearly they would miss her. Now the nightmare had unfolded in the rural outskirts of Magnolia, Texas, a peaceful community known for magnolia trees and small town charm, where violent crime was nearly unheard of until now. The first medic on the scene paused, unsure whether they were walking into a suicide, an accident, or something else entirely. As he stepped inside, a realization hit: they weren't there to save a life anymore. Angie was gone and decapitated, and her head was mercilessly dumped in the bathtub. The living room floor was soaked in blood. Cigarette butts were scattered around the body. Blood-stained clothes were tossed carelessly nearby. This wasn't just a killing, it was rage, it was personal, it was deliberate. What happened in that house between two people who once vowed forever, and what drove Jared Dicus to commit one of the most brutal acts in recent Texas memory? In fact, if anything, people might have pointed fingers at his older brother Wayne. He had long battled meth addiction and had tangled with the law more than once, starting back in 2018. When he was only 20, Jared, on the other hand, was the responsible one, the quiet one. He played football in high school, held a steady job as an electrician, and had a reputation for looking out for his troubled brother. He'd even called the police on Wayne once for stealing copper wire, though he'd later expressed regret. Now Jared had lived in the Houston area all his life. There was nothing about his background that hinted at the horror he would eventually unleash, but perhaps the cracks were there, small fractures waiting to split wide open. Then came Angie. Their paths crossed in 2022 at Cheap's Meat Market, where Angie worked as a cashier, a chance meeting that turned into a whirlwind romance. To outsiders it looked like fate. They moved fast, too fast, and by October of that year they were married. Angie Diaz had her own story. Born in Nicaragua in October 2001, she was raised by a single mother who often left the children in the care of relatives while working in Costa Rica to support them. Angie was smart, driven, and deeply loyal to her family. She studied accounting at the National Autonomous University of Nicaragua at Leon, and was known for her work ethic and maturity beyond her years. But life took a sudden turn when her aunt, the woman who had raised her like a daughter, was diagnosed with cancer. That's when her biological mother, now in the US, paid smugglers to bring Angie and her siblings across the Mexican border. They arrived undocumented, seeking hope in a place that promised more than what they'd left behind. Angie quickly found work at the meat market and began promoting herself online as a personal trainer. Her posts brimmed with optimism and resilience, reminders to celebrate your own victories because no one else truly knows what it took to earn them. But not everyone shared her urgency. Her mother, cautious and protective, told her to have patience, reminding her that things would come with time. Finances were tight, but Angie didn't want to wait. She wasn't going to sit behind a cash register forever. She had dreams, big ones, and in those dreams Jared Dicus was suddenly front and center. He came across as charming, a former football player with small-town charisma and enough edge to feel exciting. Angie was smitten. Their social media feeds became a showcase of their young love, filled with laughter, road trips, and a carefully curated intimacy for their online audience. They got married just before Angie's 21st birthday, but not everyone was convinced this was her fairy tale ending. After she said she wasn't going to get married, she gave a reason. Yes, she told me, and I asked her, but why, if she was so happy that she was going to get married? And she told me no, that the boyfriend had changed. He had become very distant. He wasn't paying attention to her, and well, I advised her a lot because I'm a bit older than her, so I advised her and told her that if she didn't feel good with him it would be better to end the relationship, according to one of her closest friends. Angie had previously been in a serious relationship with a man named Jose. She'd been planning to marry him in the US, a future that never came to be, but then she grew distant with everyone else in her life almost around the same time when she met Jared, the boy she thought would save her from the misery of a mundane life. And somewhere between letting go of that past and clinging to this new love story, Angie had rewritten her future in Jared's name. It was more of a fast-forwarded romance, so much so that Jared's family didn't even fully know who Angie really was. Miss Angie, do you know what her last name was before she and your brother got married? What's Angie's last name? Do you know her maiden last name? I don't know that. I don't know. Okay, how about her date of birth? Here's her phone here, let me see. Let me, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I don't have my fingerprints on it. Nice. Yeah, that's all you know about her? Yeah, I just know she worked over there. I know she was nice. Where'd she work? Cheapish Meat Market. Cheapish, that's where that met. Yeah, and maybe that speed wasn't just about love. There were whispers that immigration concerns played a part. Angie had once been in an accident, and rumors were there that it sparked fears of deportation in Angie's mind. The timing of their wedding, just a few months into their relationship, suddenly seemed less about fairy tale endings and more about paperwork and panic. Even her friend urged her not to rush, to slow down and truly get to know Jared before binding herself to him legally and emotionally. She'd seen too many women fall into rushed, controlling relationships and suffer quietly behind closed doors. She didn't want her dearest friend to become one of them, but Angie didn't listen. Her uncle, who was a witness at her wedding, had noticed how quickly things were moving between her and Jared, and like her mother, he grew concerned. He sat her down one day and gave her the kind of advice someone gives when they've seen too much of how the world works. He told her not to make a decision out of desperation, not for papers, not for a green card, not for legal status. He was clear with her: don't marry someone just to stay in this country. And Angie insisted. She loved Jared deeply, that they were doing fine, and all of this was real. Her family was worried. They weren't convinced that the timing was right, and when they found out Angie and Jared were getting married, it felt like it had all happened too quickly. It was hard not to wonder if their fears were being ignored, or worse, if Angie was ignoring red flags that she couldn't or wouldn't want to see, because not long after the wedding the cracks in that fresh start began to show. Maybe Angie truly believed this was her fresh start, that this love, this man, this marriage could be her new beginning, a clean break from the sacrifices and hardships of her past. But whatever happiness she clung to was built on shaky ground, because while social media told one story, a blissful young couple glowing with affection, the reality was much darker. Behind the smiles there were cracks, patterns, red flags. People close to her urged caution, asked her to set boundaries, to make sure Jared treated her with the respect she deserved. But sometimes when you're in the middle of something that feels like love, it's hard to see where adoration ends and obsession begins. And all too soon Angie would find out, when it was already far too late. When Angie first introduced Jared to her circle of close friends, it was supposed to be a casual get-together, just some laughs, shared drinks and good company. But something about it felt off even then, though no one fully grasped it at the time. They were a tight-knit group, mostly Spanish speaking, and Angie had always fit right in. That night one of her friends brought some beers, thinking it would help Jared ease into the group. Instead, it seemed to make things worse. Jared didn't speak Spanish at all, and as the conversations flowed in a language he couldn't understand, frustration began to flicker across his face. Angie, trying to bridge the gap, kept translating back and forth. Her friend noticed how tense she got, always looking to Jared as if checking whether he was okay, whether he was angry. They started calling him Rojo, red for his hair. It was a light-hearted nickname among friends, but Jared didn't laugh along. He didn't smile. He sat stiffly, disconnected, and sometimes without saying a word he'd just leave. No goodbye, no explanation. Just gone. What seemed like awkwardness at first, in hindsight began to look a lot more like resentment. Jared wasn't just irritated that he couldn't follow the conversations. He was alienated. He felt like an outsider around Angie's people in her world, and the way he handled that wasn't with curiosity or patience, it was with cold detachment. Maybe even simmering anger. After the wedding things got worse. Angie's friend remembered the shift, how Jared's Discomfort turned into distance. How he stopped making any effort, the gatherings became fewer, the joy dimmed. Angie became quieter, and when she did show up she never really seemed fully there. Looking back, her friend could trace the moment. The light in Angie's eyes started to fade. The pressure of trying to make two worlds fit together was falling squarely on Angie's shoulders, and she was doing all she could to keep it from breaking, but sometimes the cracks are too deep to hide. As 2023 rolled in, Jared Douglas was unraveling fast. By November his volatility had reached dangerous heights. He'd been arrested for driving while intoxicated after causing a scene at a local restaurant, shouting, acting aggressively toward the staff. When police arrived, they found him belligerent, punching windows. He was so out of control they had to strap him into a restraint chair just to draw a blood sample. It wasn't just alcohol. The police suspected meth was coursing through his veins. By January, Jared was out on bond, but nothing about him had stabilized behind closed doors. Angie was growing more and more afraid. She asked Jared's mother, Lynn, directly that Jared stopped sleeping in the same house as her. In the final week of her life, Jared had started asking to move back in with his parents into the house he just spent money fixing up for him and Angie. Why, no one could quite understand, but it was clear he didn't want to be in that house with Angie anymore, and maybe, just maybe, Angie didn't want him there either. You know things are serious when your boss notices it too. Ruth Almendarez had worked closely with Angie at the meat market. To her, Angie wasn't just an employee, she was like a daughter. The two shared a quiet closeness built over time. Ruth had seen her through cheerful mornings, long shifts, and bursts of laughter behind the counter, and it was at this very counter where Angie had first met Jared. But things changed after the wedding. Slowly at first, Angie, once so warm and full of light, started retreating into herself. She grew quieter, more nervous. She wasn't as quick to smile, and she was always looking over her shoulder. Jared had started showing up at the market often, too often, just standing there looking for her, hovering around the counter. It made people uncomfortable. Then came Tuesday, January 10th, the day before Angie's murder. Ruth walked in around the early afternoon and immediately sensed something was off. Her staff flagged her down, urging her to talk to Angie. At first she assumed it was a work-related issue, maybe a customer complaint or a mistake, but they said no, it was more serious than that. Angie didn't look well. Her eyes were distant, her energy drained. She looked like someone who hadn't slept, someone carrying too much. Ruth pulled her aside gently, asking what had happened. That's when she noticed it, a bruise on Angie's shoulder, and not the kind you get from bumping into a door. This was something else. Another co-worker, Erica, joined them in the back kitchen. Together they sat with Angie for a few quiet minutes. That's when she opened up. She told them she was planning to leave Jared. Maybe not one day, she was sure. She told both of us that she was leaving him and that she would never get married again. I asked her, was it really that bad? Has it been that terrible for you? Why? That's when I got closer, lifted her shirt a little, and told her, you can't let this keep happening. And then Angie said something else, things that went beyond just hitting. She told Ruth they had been arguing all night, which Ruth would later tell to the cops. That Sunday Angie had gone to the movies with her aunt, just a simple outing, something completely normal for her, but Jared hadn't wanted her to go. He didn't want her seeing anyone, didn't want her to have even a sliver of independence. When she got back home that night, it all exploded. Jared kept her up all night, refusing to let her sleep. Angie looked drained when she showed up at work the next morning, pale, hollow-eyed, like someone who had been pushed far past the edge. And then as she tried to shower and get ready for the day, the argument escalated, and then Ruth would tell the officer that Jared had assaulted Angie while she was in the shower. It wasn't a matter of if anymore. Angie had been living in fear, and now it was written across her body. As Ruth gently pressed, Angie confessed even more. This wasn't just one fight, this wasn't a bad night, it was a pattern, and she was ready to break it. She told Ruth she had made up her mind. She told Ruth that it was time to leave. Angie didn't tell Jared she was moving out, not exactly, but she did tell him that she wasn't going to keep living that way. She wasn't going to tolerate the control, the fear, the violence. It was the first real declaration of her intent to escape, but what no one knew then was that this small act of resistance, this whisper of freedom, might have been what sealed her fate. And when Angie paused while telling The horror she had faced. Ruth put a stop to the conversation, saving it for later. They made plans to talk again. Angie had Friday off and told Ruth she wanted to go for coffee somewhere quiet away from the market where she could finally say everything without people overhearing, but that coffee never happened. Tuesday was the last time Ruth saw her alive. After the murder, Ruth checked the security footage, desperate to find proof of that final conversation. The cameras had captured them talking at the register, but there was no sound, no microphone, just a silent video of a young woman, bruised and broken, sharing what she could before she ran out of time, and that silence would haunt Ruth forever. Then on the night of January 8, just 3 days before Angie's murder, something unsettling happened. At nearly midnight, Jared made a strange call to 911. He was disoriented, paranoid, and barely coherent. In a shaky voice, he claimed he'd taken drugs and needed help. He didn't seem sure of anything, not where he was, not what he had taken, not why he even called, but he did ask for an ambulance. Paramedics were dispatched immediately, but just a few minutes later Jared called again, still confused, still mumbling about feeling unwell, unsure whether he meant what he said. It was clear something had altered his state of mind, something strong. When the medics arrived, they transported him to the hospital, where it was confirmed Jared had been using methamphetamine. It was a devastating blow to his family. Jared's older brother had struggled with meth for years, tearing their family apart in the process, but Jared had never been that kid. He was the other son, the one who stayed away from the actions that would put his parents down, or so they thought. Jared had admitted to his parents briefly and in passing that he'd taken meth, only to deny it moments later. He flipped between admissions and deflections. 1 second he was crying, the next he was lying. The moments between might be uneventful for those who did not witness what happened between this couple, but it became evident on January 11th how deep trouble ran through in those days. It was a Wednesday morning, quiet, uneventful, and eerily still, but the silence was about to be shattered. Jared had returned to his home around 4 a.m. after what seemed to be a typical shift. His house, nestled in the back of his parents' property, sat dark and isolated. He slipped inside without much notice. No one saw him again for several hours. It wasn't until 12:30 p.m. that his mother Lynn caught sight of him again. He came back into their house, but something was off. He seemed nervous, unfocused, and then she heard it, a phone ringing, not his usual ringtone, not even his usual phone. It was a device she didn't recognize. Curious and concerned, Lynn questioned him about the unfamiliar phone. Jared casually claimed to have multiple phones, but the story didn't sit right. Something about the device, the look, the feel, it wasn't his. And when he finally pulled it from his pocket, the screen was in Spanish. That's when Lynn's heart dropped. She knew immediately this was Angie's phone. Angie, who never left her phone behind. Angie, who had been growing increasingly distant and afraid, who just days earlier had been bruised and exhausted from yet another sleepless, violent night. Lynn didn't wait. She bolted out of the house with her husband Rodney, heading straight toward Jared and Angie's home. Deep down she already feared the worst. There was only one entrance, the front door. As they pushed it open, a wave of darkness met them. At first they couldn't see anything, but with a single step inside, Rodney froze. What he saw would haunt him in his sleep forever. He turned to his wife and told her not to come in, but it was too late. Lynn stepped inside and saw the horror for herself. Angie's lifeless body lay inside. Her young face, once vibrant, was now still brutally silenced. Panic set in. Lynn fumbled with her phone, unable to think, unable to act. Rodney grabbed it from her and made the call, not just to report a death, but to report their own son, the boy they'd raised, the man who had once promised to protect Angie, now suspected of ending her life. Lynn would then brief the officer about her son's issues. The police were called, and when they arrived, there was no question who they would arrest. Jared had been the last person with her. He was in possession of her phone. He had a documented history of violent outbursts and drug use, and Angie had told those closest to her that she didn't feel safe anymore. This, according to investigators, was the final tragic act in a toxic, unraveling relationship. A young woman who wanted out and a man who couldn't bear to lose control. Jared was taken into custody, but that was only the beginning. The interrogation tapes would reveal even more unsettling truths about what really happened between Jared and Angie, because when police sat Jared down and started asking questions, a new Disturbing narrative began to take shape. What before or after? What did you say? You just told me before. Why did you put her head in the bathtub? You didn't tell me her hair was wet. How come? Did you turn the shower on to wash herself or to wash her hair, or what was it to wash her hair? At first Jared dissociated himself from the situation, then he cracked under pressure, telling the officers that he had used the same knife against his wife that she took out for her self-defense against him in the months that followed Angie's death. The case against Jared Douglas moved swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming: his erratic behavior, the bruises Angie had tried to explain away, the phone in his pocket that wasn't his, and most damning of all, the scene inside their home. Prosecutors argued that this was no sudden outburst, it was the tragic culmination of months of escalating violence fueled by substance abuse control and a refusal to let Angie leave. Jared's defense tried to shift the narrative, claiming he'd only used meth once, that he was confused, overwhelmed, not in his right mind, but the jury didn't buy it. On July 31st, the trial came to a close. Jared Douglas was sentenced to 40 years in prison for decades behind bars for the brutal murder of Angie. For Angie's family and friends, the sentencing brought some sense of justice, but no sentence, no number of years could ever bring her back. The young woman who dreamed of freedom, who was trying to find the courage to start over, had her life stolen before she ever got the chance. As the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper, thank you for joining me here at MR Nightcare True Crime. Stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.